Hey people, Shinobi no Kami here. In this fanfic, due to a tragic event, Naruto awakens the Rinnegan and becomes a monk. How will this affect the timeline? Will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of this new power leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy it. Tell me your thoughts in the comments section. So without any further ado, let's roll the intro. Chapter 82, Embers Part 6. The real sin is averting your eyes and failing to believe in anyone, Natsu Dragneel. It was eerily quiet within the seal as Kurama fixed his large red eye on the young blonde, as if sizing him up for something. There are a few things we need to talk about. Naruto just nodded straight away. The one thing he had hoped for in his long interactions with the Kyuubi were for them to be more open. He wanted to understand the ancient Biju, all of them. However, for as long as he had known him, Kurama had always been the obstacle preventing that. He commanded due respect amongst his kin, and unfortunately they followed him more than Naruto could ever hope to sway them. Okay, like what? The great fox huffed lightly, only enough to flap Nato's haori, at the familiar way he now found himself speaking with the blonde. On one level he did feel slightly insulted. On the other hand though, the young monk had proved time and time again that he really did only care for what was best for him and the other Biju. That Uchiha, or at least the one who bore the Sharingan, he needs to die. Naruto made to speak up at that, but he was quickly cut off with a deep glare from the fox, who was obviously not finished. That accursed mistake of our father's eldest son should have been eradicated a long time ago. Enough time has passed, and the longer their stain remains on this world, the more lives they will corrupt and poison. Once again the blonde was lightly staggered by the passion the fox had in his utter hatred for the once lofted clan of Sharingan users. You would condemn an entire clan for the actions of just a few. The Kyuubi's gaze dropped down to him again, this time burning with some unidentifiable emotion that hid just beyond the slit of his pupil. You would defend them, after they enslaved us? Naruto frowned, quickly shaking his head. You mean after Madara enslaved you? The fox banged one enormous paw down on the floor of his cell, causing the entire seal room to shudder at his now unrestrained anger. It makes no difference, the Uchiha are a blight, none of them can be redeemed, especially not that one in the mask. He reeks too much of Madara himself. Naruto let out a long breath, trying to clear the situation up a little before the Biju's anger got too out of control. It was all well and good riling up the fox when he was young in order to get responses, but back then he had the luxury of a barricade between them. In his current, practically chakra-less condition, he would be nothing more than a speck of dust for the Kyuubi's tails to sweep aside. Wait, he paused, thinking on the Biju's words. How would you know if he smelled like Madara? The fox turned so that he was fully facing the blonde, lowering himself until they were at eye level and letting out another huff of irritation. He obviously didn't appreciate the conversation deviating from killing Uchiha. I said before, your actions in destroying this cage door has afforded me certain freedoms. Naruto's gaze became wary, worrying about the possibilities of a Biju running around his body unrestrained. Was he going to be hearing voices for the rest of his life? In what way? The Biju grinned. It wasn't particularly pleasant smile either. We've become more linked, as distasteful as that sounds. I now hear what you hear, see what you see, and even feel what you feel. Naruto grimaced at that. He had a feeling this was going to make the time he spent with Fu somewhat awkward if he couldn't get over having spectators. The Kyuubi caught the look and growled lightly. Without the bars, Naruto could feel the sound reverberate through the floor. I don't appreciate it all that much either. The feelings of your small ninjan body is disorienting, to say the least. Naruto had to concede that the difference between being a building-sized anthropomorphic fox and an average-sized human must be quite odd. You shouldn't complain so much. The less booming but still powerful voice called from across the seal, drawing Naruto and the Kyuubi's attention, or at least Kurama lazily rolled his eye in that direction. Matabi was standing near the bars to her own cell, suddenly appearing slightly meeker with Naruto's Rinnegan and the Kyuubi's commanding gaze solely on her. I would give anything to feel the air on my fur again. Slowly, and in some cases reluctantly, the other Biju in the seal began to nod, agreeing with the sentiment, save for Shukaku, but the Tanuki seemed more confused by what was going on than anything. Naruto was a little startled by it all. At that moment he realized just how selfish he had been all this time. So many talks with the Biju he contained, playing with Shukaku, chatting with Matabi about random things, trying to get Isobe to come out of its shell, figuratively at least. He had enjoyed debates with Son Goku over a few heated topics, as well as argued with the Gobi until it had finally given Naruto its name, Kokuo. The two now shared a somewhat terse, but workable relationship, similar to how he had been with Kurama at first, which boded well. Seiken confused him greatly and was incredibly quiet, but all the same he tried to talk to the massive slug. However, in all that time had he really missed the underlying and underrated need each of them felt towards their stolen freedom? I'm just as bad as him, aren't I? Kurama looked around, raising his brow as he saw Naruto with his head lowered, a confused, saddened expression across his features. I'm imprisoning you all, never once asking if this was what you wanted. He shook his head slowly, his hand balling into a fist. I tried to rationalize that I was protecting you, that the Akatsuki couldn't get you, but that was just treating you as objects, weapons to be abused. Naruto was shocked out of his small monologue that had grown louder until he was shouting, quite literally. He stared up at the Kyuubi, who slowly withdrew his long tail that had knocked Naruto to the floor none too gently. Do not compare yourself to that man. The fox's expression confused the young monk. It wasn't angry, just stern was probably the best way to describe it. That man was a coward, using the gifts given to him by our father's blood and abusing it to bend me and others to his will, treating us like house pets. The ancient Biju lowered himself until he was as close to eye level as he could get with the blonde. You never chose to have me inside of you, and everything that came after was either your misguided actions as a child, or out of what you thought to be best. The fox seemed to realize just how he sounded at that moment, as the stern look was rapidly exchanged for one of mild annoyance. In any case, it is not as though I would wish to be placed in any construct you created through your so-called mastery of the Banbutsu Suzu. Naruto stood up slowly, a frown still marring his features as he thought on what the Kyuubi said. I can still help you all though, offer you the same freedom as Kurama has. A few of the Biju seemed roused by that, especially Matabi, and looked ready to agree until the Kyuubi interrupted. That would be a poor idea. The Nibi seemed highly indignant to that as she glared at her much larger brother. You just want the freedom all to yourself. However, the fire seemed to die a little as she was once again placed under the fox's full glare. Don't think me so, petty cat. Destroying the bars of my cell was one thing, to do the same for them all. I do not understand the entire concept of this ninjan seal, but to damage it so much, a light growl escaped his lips, would be ill-advised. The Yondaime Hokage was clever enough to seal me in here, he would have made countermeasures against such tampering. Naruto looked ready to weigh in, but Kurama had not finished yet, bringing his attention once more around to the blonde. Which brings me to my next point. I assume you have some most likely foolish idea of how to break the bonds restraining your chakra. Naruto seemed just a little indignant at that, frowning to himself. It's not foolish. However, after a moment of the Kyuubi and the rest of the Biju staring at him in deadpan silence, he reluctantly nodded, eliciting a grunt from the fox. Well, do not. Naruto looked up in surprise. From all his talk of the indignancy of having his chakra restrained, Naruto would have thought removing the seal would be high on Kurama's priorities. Luckily for him, the ancient Biju saw fit to explain himself. I believe one of the functions of this cage was to slowly filter my chakra into you over time. Without it, all of my chakra has been open to you. Naruto again looked ready to interject, but once again he was prevented as with another sweeping move the Kyuubi knocked him down again with a lazy flick from his tail. Naruto suspected the old fox was getting more amusement from being able to do that than he was letting on. Yes, I know you have stated your intentions never to use our chakra for whatever prideful reason you possess, but that is far from the point. Right now that restriction seal is the only thing preventing the full might of my own chakra flooding your being. It had already begun to happen during your conflict with that Uchiha. Naruto frowned, remembering how much crueler he felt as he attempted to crush the man with his prey path. Whatever your plan is, allow it to happen over time, otherwise you will probably end up dying, or worse turning yourself into an invalid. It would be humiliating. Naruto nodded firmly, he had finally gained some measure of the Kyuubi's trust, he wasn't going to squander it by not heeding his advice. I still promise to find a way to let you experience freedom, even if it's only in some small way. He directed this to the other Biju this time, making sure they heard the sincerity in his voice. We know you'll try, Naruto. He smiled thankfully at Mitabi. She had always been the most cooperative and friendly of the Biju, like a flaming older sister with surprisingly soft fur. In any case though, whatever your plans, make them fast. That impostor who supposedly bears the sage's eyes needs to be dealt with. There can only be one wielder of the Rinnegan, and if I must place my backing behind one of them, it may as well be the one who does not intend to wield my chakra as a weapon of some kind. Naruto had to smirk lightly at that. It was the closest he had heard in the way of support from the Kyuubi since they had first met all that time ago. You certainly know how to send mixed messages. The Kyuubi gave a long huff, curling up on himself and closing his eyes, as if dismissing the blonde. Your concerns are not mine, Naruto. Deal with thee as you must, just do not kill yourself. It would be inconvenient. Naruto just couldn't resist one last jab as he stood back up, walking towards the Kyuubi's cell until he was within touching distance of the giant fox. His only response is a slight twitching of his great snout, so he took that as a good sign. Is that your way of saying you care? His response was Kurama's eyes cracking open just an inch and leveling him with a glare more intense than he had done for a long time. The blonde just chuckled sheepishly, taking a quick step back as he decided not to push his waning luck. Alright, but seriously, does this mean we can talk a bit more now? You won't just rebuke my questions. The eye opened a little wider as the fox was silent for a few moments, studying the blonde lazily. I suppose it depends on how I feel, doesn't it? Naruto grinned, sitting himself down on the floor again as he released a small, unnoticed sigh of relief. Great, because this has been bugging me for a while. Have you been getting bigger, or is it just me? The lone open eye continued to search him for a few moments before Kurama let out what sounded suspiciously like an amused huff. The slight upturn of his lips didn't help disguise it either. I suppose you would have to notice sooner or later, wouldn't you? Naruto didn't respond as the Kyuubi took a pause, seemingly collecting itself. This concept of just freely talking with a human was fairly alien to the very old creature. For the longest time it had simply seemed contemptible. Before that he was too feared to ever have been approached by one, and before even that, the large fox released a long breath it hadn't even realized it had been holding before turning its head to look at Naruto. The me you saw when we first met was not all of me, simply the aspect of my yang chakra. I was unbalanced, torn, and more importantly, weak, only possessing half of my full power. Had I been released from your body at that time, even I am not sure what would have happened, although I suppose I would have lacked the ability to construct a solid body for myself. Again Naruto stayed silent, even if he was brimming with questions. This opportunity, of the Kyuubi opening up, seemed too good to ruin. Even the Biju seemed intrigued after the self-admission of weakness from their prideful brother. What changed? Eventually Naruto did have to speak up. The Kyuubi had remained silent, seemingly in thought, for a good 30 seconds. A low growl escaped the creature's mouth as he fought with himself for a moment before reluctantly lowering his head. I have you to thank for the return of my other half. Deadly silence reigned in the seal as the Biju stared in shock at the Kyuubi, the very same Kyuubi who had openly admitted his own thanks to another being. When you absorbed my stray chakra from that other monk boy, it contained just a small portion of my yin. It was meager, but it was enough that I could begin culturing it within myself, restoring my full power slowly. The creature looked up for a moment, thinking to himself. I would say in around another half year I will be restored to how I was in my previous Jinchuriki. At that, Naruto's interest was piqued. After all, the Kyuubi was actually being open with him. He no longer felt restricted in what he could say. Previous Jinchuriki. What were they like? Kurama's attention was brought back down, and for a good few moments he carefully scrutinized the boy, gauging something that Naruto couldn't quite figure out. She cared little for me. In fact, I only spoke with her once. It was when she came within herself to tell me to stay quiet, locked away inside of her where my power could cause no hatred. She was just like the others before her, foolishly believing that love was the only way to suppress my power. The Kyuubi seemed ready to continue, but his ears suddenly twitched, a vaguely irritated expression crossing his features for a split second. It seems we are no longer alone. Naruto was about to question what he meant, but when he blinked he suddenly found himself staring out at the tranquil pond, no longer in his seal. Hey, I asked what you were doing here. The blonde blinked again, looking around only to see a boy around his age with dark hair and darker eyes staring at him with a dispassionate, but at the same time irritated, glare. He was covered in bandages, most noticeable around his exposed torso, and was walking with just the slightest hint of a limp, which likely meant he had just come back from a mission. At least Naruto assumed the boy was a shinobi from the headband wrapped around the boy's bicep. He also looked vaguely familiar, although Naruto couldn't quite place it, maybe if the hair was a little different. Hey, you some kind of idiot or something? Naruto blinked once again, realizing he had been staring, and quickly adopted a kindly, apologetic smile. Sorry, I suppose I was a little lost there for a moment. The boy gave a rather unremarkable, vague grunt of acknowledgement, walking a bit closer. What are you doing here? This is Uchiha clan property. Naruto looked around in surprise, finally taking notice of the faded fan insignias he had seen dotted about the emptied district of the village. At the same time he distinctly heard a growl from somewhere in the back of his mind, however he chose to ignore that. Sorry, I didn't realize. I was simply looking for somewhere quiet to meditate for a bit. It's been a while since I had the chance, and this village is just a little overwhelming at times. The boy scrutinized him for a moment before giving a curt nod, however his gaze lingered a bit longer on the blonde's hair. Do I know you from somewhere? Naruto raised a brow at that, so it wasn't just him, however after another second the Uchiha's eyes widened in realization. You were that boy we met in Nami no Kuni. You had that green-haired girl with you. For some reason Naruto wasn't pleased with how the boy had brought up Fu, but he put that aside. Surprisingly Sasuke, if he remembered his name right, sat down next to him on the end of the jetty, looking out over the waters. When he realized Naruto was starting at him he simply glared at the boy. He was rather perturbed though when he realized it had no effect whatsoever. What? Naruto shook his head, turning away and staring over the pond, shrugging casually. Nothing, it just seemed like something is bothering you. Sasuke grunted something unintelligible before going quiet for a few moments. So what do you care? Naruto also stayed quiet, weighing up his options. To be honest it was none of his concern, but at the same time he had little else to do other than question his tenants before Fu woke up. It wasn't like he had anything particularly planned during his, hopefully short, tenure in the village. Fu had once told him he cared too much. She was probably right. It helps to talk about it. Sasuke looked around at him, his face quizzically arranged, as if he wasn't sure whether to scowl at the idea or simply dismiss it. In either case he just grunted, turning away and staring at his reflection in the crystal-clear waters of the pond. Naruto smiled lightly, tapping the boy on the shoulder. Come on, I'm a monk, it's not like I'll be around for much longer, you might never even see me again after this. Plus, I've been told I offer good advice. Sasuke scowled at his reflection for a moment before his shoulders seemed to slump just a little, a sigh escaping his lips almost inaudibly. What advice do you have for someone who killed his only brother, his only family? Naruto's eyes slowly widened as he took his arm back. Sasuke's voice was a growl, and in his reflection he could see the boy's Sharingan had activated and was slowly rotating. What happened? Sasuke looked up, the scowl lessening as it was replaced somewhat by surprise. He hadn't expected much past that sentence. Even his teammates had shied away from him when he told them what he had done. It hadn't helped much that he was still covered in the aforementioned brother's blood. Itachi Uchiha. His voice returned to a low growl as his hand slowly clenched into a fist, his features twisting into a mask of fury. The man who murdered my clan, my family. And so for the first time in a long time Sasuke merely vented. He talked for a good 10 minutes, pouring out everything that had happened on that horrific day, all to this practical stranger. Maybe it was because he didn't know him, or maybe it was just because it had been bottled up inside of him for too long and it finally needed to be let out. When he was finished he was breathing a little harder, but at the same time he felt lighter, a little less burdened. Naruto on the other hand had a rather troubled expression on his face. he remembered his own meeting with Itachi, as a member of the Akatsuki. He just couldn't place the image of a psychopathic murderer with that calm young man, even if he was a member of the Akatsuki. All the same, it just went to show that you really couldn't judge people on your preconceptions of them. It was almost frightening. So what now then? Will you carry through with your goal? Restore your clan? Sasuke paused, his brow furrowing as he stared at his hand, closing it and opening it a few times. I'm not sure. For the longest time I thought it would be so easy. I always had a driving force. Gain power, become strong enough to challenge Itachi, defeat him and reclaim the honor of the Uchiha before restoring my clan to how they should be. Naruto once again heard a quiet snort from the back of his mind and once again chose to ignore it. He had meant what he said to the Kyuubi, about not immediately dismissing a clan for the actions of a single man like Madara. But, Sasuke nodded slowly, still just staring at his hand. He could still see it, feel it even, the blood of his brother. Absently he raised a hand and gently touched his forehead, remembering Itachi's smile in his last moments. He nearly jumped when he felt Naruto's hand on his shoulder, the blonde smiling sadly. It wasn't what you were expecting, right? Sasuke raised an eyebrow at the other boy, his voice held a certain level of understanding. I may not be able to compare to losing my entire family in a single night, but as advice from someone who has experienced both the horror of loss and the hollow feeling of revenge, don't push people away. Sasuke blinked as Naruto stood up, feeling compelled to join him as the two stood on the end of the short pier. Naruto actually gave the boy a smile as a short chuckle escaped him, confusing the dark-haired Uchiha. I suppose if I was younger I might parrot off a saying from one of my sensei, just expecting the words to be wise. He shook his head slowly, a sad smile etching his features for a moment. However, words spoken that aren't yours are just as hollow as a Pyrrhic victory, so I'll say something that I spent a long time thinking about after killing the man who took away the first girl I loved. If Sasuke seemed shocked that Naruto had killed a man, just a blonde monk he had never really thought much of during the time in Wave, he didn't show it. He saw it in the blonde's expression, the way he held himself. He could see the loss the other teen had suffered, just like him. However, he did show surprise when Naruto finally looked up, capturing him for a moment on those vibrant rippled eyes. Don't push away the people closest to you. It doesn't make you stronger to carry your burden alone. While no amount of time will wipe away the memories, having people to stand by, to care for you, will make them seem just that little bit less important. Sasuke blinked, snapping himself out of his semi-trance at the surprise over the blonde having a dujutsu. He had never managed to see his eyes in Nami. However, before he was able to reply he was cut off as a new voice entered the picture. Hey Sasuke. The Uchiha turned to see Sakura and Kiba running up to him, although it appeared more like Sakura was dragging the Inuzuka along with her against his will. When they stopped, Sakura smiled brightly at the young clan heir as she pushed Kiba forward, rather forcefully too. Sasuke, I'm glad we found you. Kiba and I had something we wanted to ask you. She leveled a particularly frightening glare at the young dog lover, at least to those who knew of Sakura's temper. Didn't we, Kiba? Kiba quickly nodded, his eyes widened in fear, unable to turn away from Sakura's frightening visage until she turned to smile sweetly at Sasuke. Yeah, I guess, if you want to go get some akisoba or something I suppose. Ow. The brown-haired boy lightly rubbed the back of his head, glaring weakly at Sakura, who simply continued to be the picture of utter innocence, clenched fist hidden behind her back notwithstanding of course. We would like it if you came along. Kiba rolled his eyes as he finished, already predicting his Uchiha teammate's typical response of a disinterested, frustratingly vague grunt. Yeah, sure. Kiba waved his hand nonchalantly, already turning to leave. I told you he wouldn't go for it, Sakura, but you just didn't leave. The Inuzuka paused for a moment, the gears in his head visibly turning for a moment to the point where smoke was almost visibly pouring from his ears. Wait, what? Sasuke just nodded, hands in his pockets as he projected as good an air of disinterest as he could. I said I'll go, just let me. He turned to say one last thing to Naruto only to find that the blonde had somehow vanished while he was distracted. Never mind, let's just go. Akisoba, right? Kiba just nodded dumbly as he allowed Sasuke to walk right by him, a dumbfounded expression firmly plastered on his face. You going to stand there all day, dog breath? That quickly snapped Kiba out of his confusion as he swiveled angrily on his heel. Hey, who you calling? Ow. He once again rubbed his head as Sakura happily skipped past him to catch up with Sasuke, just glad the boy didn't seem to be isolating himself anymore. From a few houses away, hardly hidden by the late afternoon shadows, Naruto watched with a small, satisfied smile as the three friends walked off into the village together. Even if Sasuke seemed a little cold, he hoped their short talk would at least help the boy to think and come to his own conclusions. The teen was at a dangerous crossroads, but Naruto was certain with the support of his friends he would make the right choice. Naruto had been there as well, and without the people he cared about he could have taken a wholly different and much darker past. His yummy half was proof enough of that. I still say my method would be easier. The little Uchiha wouldn't have to worry about turning to a darker path if his head was a few hundred feet from his body. Naruto grimaced as he placed 2 fingers on his temple, feeling a slight headache coming on as he walked back into the village in the direction of the hospital, or more specifically Fu. Having Kurama speaking directly to him without having to enter the seal was definitely going to have to take some getting used to, especially if it was only to make comments like that. Naruto was roused from his light sleep not by the rays of the early morning sun through the hospital room's blinds, but as the hand he was holding suddenly tightened its grip. Instantly the blonde was alert as Fu stirred, her amber eyes blinking open to the side of messy blonde hair and concern-filled violet eyes that had her naturally smiling. However, like him, she immediately noticed the comfort of the bed beneath her, a stark contrast to what she could remember, which was not all that much, and her smile slipped away. Naruto. What happened? Where are we? She sat up only to have her head swim at the sudden elevation. Her body felt a lot lighter all of a sudden and strangely cold. It took the better part of the morning for Naruto to explain what he knew of the previous 2 days' events, including her control by the unknown Uchiha, her attacking him, which he played down greatly for her own benefit, and their capture by Konoha. By the end of it the girl had donned a deep, thoughtful expression that the monk knew to mean she was thinking everything through carefully. I see, then for now we are captives in Konohagakure, but we are able to move around freely. I presume there is a similar seal on me as there is on you. Naruto shrugged. He wouldn't have imagined Tsunade allowing something like that to occur under her watch, but then again, who was to say how long it had been until Fu was placed under her care? However, Naruto couldn't help but feel concern for the mint-haired girl. Her voice seemed a little hollow after the revelation that the Nanbi was no longer inside of her. Fu, the girl looked up at him, smiling with melancholy on her soft features, squeezing his hand for comfort. You don't need to feel so worried, Naruto. I will miss Chome, but it is not as though we will never meet again. Naruto returned the smile, nodding quickly. As a former Jinchuriki, it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that she could be drawn into the shared mindscape of the Biju. But then, there is no chance of returning her to me. I still want to help carry your burdens however I can, even if I do not see the Biju as such. Naruto shook his head slowly, his gaze turning downwards. He had plenty of time to think about this and talk to Kurama while Fu was asleep. No, when Chome was extracted, the seal that bound her to you was rendered useless and basically fell apart. Without it I would just be forcing her chakra into your system, most likely killing you. Fu just nodded her understanding. Neither of them were seal masters to say the least, and she doubted Konoha would lend them one just to perform a trivial switching of Jinchuriki. She sighed slowly before swinging her legs out so that she could stand up, Naruto instinctually rising with her, her hand still grasped firmly in his own. She briefly looked down at that connection, faltering for a moment as she found herself unable to lift her head back up to meet his eyes. Naruto, I'm sorry. Naruto smiled confusedly at her, drawing her in closer only for her to take a step back. She didn't let go of his hand though. For what, Fu? If anything, I should be apologizing. Fu quickly shook her head, still unable to lift her gaze. No, I attacked you. I can't imagine how it must have felt to have to fight me. I could never. She didn't finish, but Naruto knew what she meant. Already with Shizuku, and now with me. I should have been faster, not fallen for that man's trap. Naruto felt the grip around his hand tighten when she mentioned the unknown Uchiha. However, anything more Fu might have said was cut off as Naruto pulled her in close, carefully wrapping her up in his embrace. Fu, please, you're safe and alive, that's all that matters. A solitary tear wound down the contours of the former Jinchuriki's face as she accepted the hug, pulling her body as close to Naruto's as she could manage, a short laugh escaping her lips. Maybe this isn't so bad after all, being captured. Naruto raised a quizzical eyebrow but let the girl continue. He was certain she was probably just venting. Perhaps, for a little while, we could just pretend to be normal. No chakra, no life-changing journey for peace and understanding, no Akatsuki hunting us. Naruto sighed into the girl's hair, a light, saddened smile on his face. Phew, another laugh escaped the mint-haired girl's lips, although it sounded more like a sigh than anything else. I know, it's selfish, too selfish, but she slowly released the blonde, stepping back a moment before gently raising a hand to brush against the blank headband he wore. You bear so many burdens, carry so many dreams on your back. She gently slid the horned headband off his head, smiling lightly when his messy hair fell about his eyes. That just this once, she reached around and gently removed his earring, quickly following it by slipping the necklace she had given him over his head. You can just be Naruto Uzumaki. Finally she took the shakuju he held in his other hand, gently prying it from his grasp before setting it to one side against a wall, and nothing else. Naruto had a vaguely amused smile playing across his face, quickly mirrored by the girl in front of him. Normal. Fu nodded slowly, their eyes never leaving one another. Either they had gotten exceptionally good at hiding their pain or they had really gone a little bit insane to be smiling after everything they had just been through. It was most likely combination of the two if they were being perfectly honest with themselves. For just a few days. Naruto looked up thoughtfully. He needed a while to slowly integrate Kurama's chakra into his system anyway, and Fu would no doubt require time to grow accustomed to the sudden change of not being a Jinchuruki. I suppose that wouldn't be too bad. What's the worst that could really happen in a few days? Deep metallic gray eyes opened slowly, revealing the concentric rings around the small pupil as the owner of the eyes looked up from their thought, the rain falling across their face not bothering them in the slightest as they felt a presence approach. Zetsu, their voice was deep, the kind that naturally commanded attention, yet oddly emotionless, more appropriate for a puppet. I assume you coming here means the Kyuubi Jinchuriki has finally stopped moving. The completely black being behind the owner of the rippled eyes nodded, his single yellow eye betraying nothing. Yes, Pain-sama, he is currently in Konoha. If Pain had been any other man he might have laughed from the irony, however the stoic leader of a Megakure merely stood, his long black cloak, proudly adorned with red clouds flapping in the wind and rain. How appropriate. Zetsu shuffled uneasily behind the orange-haired man, the black being always felt uneasy in this man's presence. Should me and Toby go capture him? The smallest of smiles slowly played across Aim's leader's features. No, I think I will go myself this time. It was only after Zetsu left after a quick nod that Pain returned to his musings, staring out over the rain-swept vista of his village. So, the two legacies of the sage finally meet. I wish to see your convictions for myself, Naruto Uzumaki. Chapter 83, Embers Part 7. Men would be angels, angels would be gods. Alexander Pope. Naruto had decided he rather liked this whole, acting normal, concept Fu had suggested for their time here in Konoha. For some reason that was hard to explain, he felt lighter, without all of his various trinkets that had been given to him across his travels. It felt as though the dreams those small, normally insignificant items represented could simply be set to the side for now until he was ready to pick them up and continue on again. The village itself was also different to how he remembered it. It would seem that 10 years was longer than he thought, as without his headband or shakuju Naruto had found not even a single glance sent his way. Right now he and Fu were sat in a small out-of-the-way cafe somewhere not quite in the middle of the village where there would be hustle and bustle rushing past them constantly, but not quite on the outskirts where it would be too quiet. He gently nursed his tea, smiling lightly at the flavor. It certainly wasn't the best he had ever had, but it was far from the worst. It was simply normal, and Naruto found that perfectly fitting with the atmosphere. He set the cup down and looked across at his companion, unable to help the small amused smile that flickered across her lips when he saw she wasn't exactly sharing his sentiments. Why is he still here? Currently the mint-haired former Jinchuriki was doing her absolute very best to burn a large hole into the man sitting at the table with them with nothing but the power of her own vision. The man in question didn't seem too bothered with the glare, happily drinking the small dish of sake in front of him as if he was used to this type of treatment. With his kind of reputation and the way Naruto had first met the man, it would have been incredibly unsurprising. The man dipped the tray back, slurping down the last of the sake with all the manners of a drunken tsunade before slamming it back down onto the table with a happy grin. "Ah, what's the matter, cutie? You must really want some alone time with your boyfriend." If it was possible, Fu's glare managed to increase in intensity to the point where other patrons began to look around, feeling some kind of chilling presence they couldn't explain. Again, though, the man simply shrugged off the look. Even if he did seem somewhat surprised a girl that young could muster this kind of killing intent and focus it at him so effectively, like a miniature tsunade. Now that particular thought was enough to send a small shiver running down his spine. Naruto finally decided to intervene before the other patrons of the little cafe decided to leave. He was uncomfortable enough as it was with the attention they were already garnering. Now Fu, you can be a little nicer." The man sitting across from them smirked at the younger girl in a way that was far too smug for his own good. "After all, Jiraiya is going to buy us lunch." The smirk slipped off his face in an instant as the Toad Sage's eyes went wide, staring down at the very large lunch Naruto and Fu had ordered for themselves. They were each Jinchuriki after all, their metabolisms were quite a bit higher than most normal shinobi. Even if Fu no longer contained her tenant, it seemed that, like with Gaara, she had retained many of the more positive aspects of her Biju, such as her stamina, healing, and durability. It remained to be seen if the girl could still manifest her chakra wings, but they wouldn't be able to tell until Naruto could remove the suppression seals. Hey, I don't remember agreeing to that, Gaki." Naruto simply turned to gaze at the much larger man, his eyes scrunched up into narrow lines as a serene yet unwholesomely vicious smile graced his features. "But it's the least you could do after the small incident this morning, right, Jiraiya?" Somewhere, in a place completely unrelated to the elemental nations, or possibly even that dimension, a young-looking purple-haired woman sweeping the backyard of the inn she lived in smiled coldly, feeling that somewhere, a pervert was being punished. "Aha, Reet," Jiraiya just nodded slowly, a drop of cold sweat slowly sliding down the side of his face. The smile the blonde was giving him was far more terrifying than any killer intent-infused glare he had gotten from a scorned woman. The worst part was he couldn't explain why. There was no killer intent, no outward sign of irritation, just the smile. Naruto, however, simply nodded in satisfaction, returning to his cup of tea with a less terrifying smile. "And you can finish making up for your illicit activities later." Somewhere, that same purple-haired young woman looked up to the sky, a single tear rolling down her smiling face. She knew that out there, somebody understood her. Jiraiya, on the other hand, firmly decided not to repeat the circumstances that had put him in this situation. Namely, him peeping on the women's hot springs when Fu just so happened to be relaxing in the steamy, fenced-off area. Somehow, even with his chakra blocked and heavily suppressed, the young blonde had managed to find the man, appearing out of nowhere and defying reason when he managed to actually sneak up on Konoha's self-proclaimed super pervert. Yeah, sure, Jiraiya just nodded along to it dejectedly. He hadn't actually planned on the kid's girlfriend being there when he peeped, it was just one of those coincidences. However, it hadn't exactly made an excellent first impression on the boy, and to be honest, the boy didn't need even more reasons to be distrustful of Konoha without his own girlfriend's privacy being put into question. Apparently, though, the beating he had received at the hands of the many angry kunoichi that had been alerted to his illicit activities wasn't good enough for Naruto. He had heard the kid had spent some time with Tsunade before she came back to the village, but it was as though he had inherited her intense hatred for all things perverted. "So, you really are Naruto, huh?" None of them had spoken for a good few minutes as an awkward silence settled over the table, so it came as a small surprise when Jiraiya finally spoke up, his voice oddly subdued. Naruto simply sipped at his drink, his face still portraying the epitome of uncaring as he had promised himself he would when dealing with shinobi of the village. He was under no illusions that the Hokage would be doing his utmost to try and form bonds between himself and those in the village in order to gain either his trust or his loyalty, even if only by proxy. "That is my name." Jiraiya let out a humorous chuckle, obviously finding something amusing about that which only seemed to irk Fu. She liked Naruto's name. "You're very different than that little knuckle-headed blonde I remember running around the village when he was nothing more than a brat." Naruto made sure to take an extra long sip of his tea, even though the flavor had long since lost interest to him. "A lot has changed since then. I was in this village for less than half my life already, and most of those years I was far too young to remember. Not to mention that much of the memories I do remember are better left forgotten. It was subtle, but Naruto just about managed to catch the much larger man wince at that. The blonde found that interesting. The white-haired pervert seemed to struggle with something for a moment before taking a swig of his sake. You know, once I heard you left, I searched for you. Naruto merely quirked an eyebrow, his frosty demeanor not dropping for a moment. He just refused to show anything towards the people keeping him in chains, as invisible as they were. I imagine you would. A hidden village without its Jinchuriki is greatly weakened after all. Another wince from the older man that Naruto found interesting, regret or guilt maybe. No, not like that. However, Jiraiya trailed off, unable to articulate what he wanted. No, needed to say. His sensei had been adamant that Naruto not find out about certain things yet, and he was so limited in what he could say. Once again, like with Hiruzen, Naruto took the man's silence for what he could only take it to be, lies and hidden truths. He really shouldn't have been surprised from shinobi of a hidden village, it was how they operated after all. Why are you here, Jiraiya-san? Are you here to try and install bonds of trust between us? I assure you that as long as my chakra is chained away within myself, those bonds would be like building a house atop sand. Perhaps you are here to inspect my seal, to make sure the Kyuubi has no more power than it should over me. Or are you interested in a student of your teammate? Tsunade-sensei has already told me a lot about you. Jiraiya tried to grin at that, but it was hollow at best. Each question was like a little knife in his back being slowly twisted. All good, I hope. Naruto simply blinked in that same cold manner as the large man's head fell down again, still searching for his own answer to the question. Maybe I could train you. That would be good, wouldn't it? Training from two of the Densetsu no Sannin. The request felt as desperate as it sounded, and Jiraiya knew it was a weak hope at best. However, in his mind there still had to be something of that little blonde he remembered watching that seemed so eager to fall among the ranks of the legendary shinobi of the past. Naruto for his part let a small sigh escape through his lips, blowing the steam from his tea gently outward as he held it near his mouth. I am not a shinobi, Jiraiya-san, nor do I wish to be. Again the man seemed to subtly wince at the formal suffix, finding it uncomfortable to talk to the boy like they were nothing more than two total strangers. I have no interest in learning jutsu like the ones you have to offer. I trained under Tsunade-sama because I saw that her healing was the best way to protect that which was precious to me. Jiraiya didn't miss that slight glance Naruto gave towards Fu, a twinge of pride entering his eyes briefly as he remembered seeing that same look of concern and love in the eyes of a similar blonde. But sometimes the best or only way to protect something is with your own power. This time Jiraiya found his voice to hold a little more confidence, finally seeing a way into spending some time with the boy. However, far from the reaction he was expecting, Naruto's eyes narrowed even farther, his hand naturally clenching into a fist. And sometimes that right there is the very reason we lose something precious in the first place. Being too focused on gaining power or failing to understand what we already have. In Naruto's eyes it was almost like Shizuku's phantom blood was really there on his hands, dripping away on the floor in that ever-constant, rhythmic pattering that had haunted him, however subtly, since her passing. At that moment, as Jiraiya saw that pained look enter the young monk's eyes, he knew he had failed the boy. He had obviously experienced a great deal of loss in his time, and he knew it was, in part, because Jiraiya wasn't there for him at the beginning. Maybe you're right. Jiraiya's face was a mask of troubled expression as he stood up from the table, absently throwing down more than enough money to cover both his and the two teens' food. However, before he left he gave one last glance back at the blonde and the girl that had shuffled around to sit closer to him, a brief smile passing over his features. But maybe there's still time. He spoke the last part as nothing more than a whisper as he walked away, suddenly having a lot to think about, the questions he was going to ask about the Rinnegan completely forgotten. When the Toad Sage was no longer in sight, Naruto allowed the cold mask he had been wearing to fall away. It was more for appearances at this point anyway. Plus, he was only in the company of Fu now, so hiding his emotions from the girl he loved was counterproductive. He didn't particularly care that there were Anbu hidden in strategic positions around them. They could report whatever they liked back to their Hokage. Perhaps it would not have been so bad to take up the man on his offer of training. Naruto raised an amused eyebrow at Fu. As far as she had come emotionally, she was still a very tactical and forward-thinking person deep down. However, he couldn't help but chuckle when he looked around only to see her scowling in the direction the white-haired Sannin had gone. Even if he is a pervert. She looked at him, her ever-lengthening hair moving so it covered one of her eyes in a manner that added an air of mystery and seduction to her appearance even if it was unintentional. Inwardly, Naruto knew this girl could ask of him almost anything and he would do his best to move the earth to get it done. At the same time, the girl had no idea of the influence she had over what could potentially be one of the most powerful men in the elemental nations. Really, you would have me learn from somebody other than Tsunade-sensei. Naruto held a hand over his heart, giving an over-exaggerated expression of hurt that made Fu smirk lightly. How could you ask me to betray her so? After a moment or two both of them began laughing, an air of serenity coming over the both of them. However, after a moment or two Fu brushed her hair back over her ear and gave Naruto a slightly more serious expression, somewhat subverted by the smile she couldn't seem to remove from her features. But really, it could be an opportunity to have the seals on our chakra removed. The verdette spoke in a hushed tone so their watchers wouldn't overhear, and Naruto had to admit the idea had merit, as for Jiraiya to teach him anything he would require the use of his chakra. It wouldn't work. Jiraiya is a Sannin for a reason and a capable practitioner of Fuinjutsu. Naruto gestured to his stomach where he suspected the restraining seal to be. I have already learned not to underestimate him when it comes to that particular field of the shinobi arts. The blonde shook his head slowly, his expression too becoming more serious. No, it would be best that we did this on our own, when we are ready. The seal needed to be removed slowly anyway. It was still too dangerous to remove lest he be rushed by the Kyuubi's caustic chakra. Naruto looked up from his thought when he felt a hand lightly brush his shoulder, seeing Fu smile at him softly. Okay, we'll move as fast as you want to, you know I'll do anything you want me to. The two shared that smile for a brief moment, knowing that for one another there was nothing too large to ask, yet at the same time, it would never be asked of them. There was a brief pause before the two's lips met, each leaning further into the contact as Naruto's arm made its way to its natural resting place around Fu's waist and her hands came up to the back of his head, to deepen the kiss. They were still smiling when they parted, a thin trail of saliva bridging their lips like their bodies weren't ready to part just yet. I love you, Fu. The girl's smile didn't grow anymore, but it was like a spark was lit behind her vibrant orange eyes. And I love you, Naruto. The pause was significantly shorter this time before the two leaned in and were once again lost in each other's embrace. Izumo and Katetsu, nicknamed the Eternal Chunin by a few of their colleagues that had long since moved up the rankings to Junin, sat where they could almost always be found, in front of Konoha's gate. They were always here because the Hokage had little else to do with them. They rarely took missions and even more rarely ones outside of Hai no Kuni. So there they were, lounging behind the desk that new entrants to the village, such as merchants and shinobi coming back from missions, all had to go through in order to enter Konoha. This was not because they weren't powerful. As a duo they were actually quite formidable and their rank didn't particularly reflect their ability to go toe-to-toe with many Junin. Nor was it because they were incompetent as many would believe. In fact, most of their paperwork was done promptly and correctly. They had an important job after all. They had to make sure there were no scruples with incoming entrants' information, to weed out potential spies. The simple fact of it was that the two were just very lazy, thus the reason for what they were currently doing. Got any twos? In their defense, it had been a particularly slow week for them. It was approaching the middle of summer and the heat in Hai no Kuni made traveling uncomfortable for many merchants, so there wasn't much traffic through the gate. Nope, go fish. Katetsu grimaced as he was forced to pick up another card from the pack. He was now entirely sure his partner and friend since the academy was cheating. He was so focused on the game though that he didn't notice the presence behind him until it was right beside the desk. Oh hey, welcome to Konoha. Sign your name and reason for visit here. The Chunin absently pulled one of the forms from the neat stack and handed it to the man behind him without even looking. However, when he looked up to continue the game, he only saw Izumo looking at something behind him. His eyes widened in shock and fear. Where is the Kyuubi Jinchuriki? Katetsu quickly turned around, only to blanch at the sight before him, the iconic symbol of the Akatsuki embroidered on a plain black cloak. All the Chunin-level shinobi and above had been notified of their status as S-ranked criminals in case the organization decided to come to Konoha in search of the Kyuubi Jinchuriki. It seemed that day had come. What? Both Chunin found themselves paralyzed by the man in front of them. His mere presence radiated power and his cold gaze seemed to stare right through them. He was tall, with long orange hair that hung down in a long bang to the left side of his face like many Yamanaka. However, with the many black piercings across the man's face, it was certain he was not of the Mind-Walking clan. However, that wasn't the worst of it. When Kotetsu looked up, he found himself staring into a cold set of rippled steel-gray eyes. "Where is Naruto Uzumaki?" The man's voice was hard and blunt, emotionless even, and he didn't seem to blink even once, just boring his gaze into the frightened Chunin. After a moment of hesitation though, the Rinnegan bearer narrowed his eyes. At the same moment Kotetsu widened his. The Chunin looked down in disbelief at the long black rod that had pierced straight through the desk and through his stomach, steadily being stained crimson. In the next moment the Akatsuki member turned to look at the other gate guard with precisely the same even gaze. "Where is Naruto Uzumaki?" Hiruzen Sarutobi, Sandaime Hokage of Konohagakure, was running across his beloved village's rooftops. Around him hundreds of shinobi had mobilized, darting this way and that to relay messages, fortify strategic locations and ferry away civilians to safe points and bunkers. All of this because of one man, or at least that was what the intelligence would have him believe. The village had been alerted to the man's presence as soon as he had passed through the invisible barrier surrounding Konoha, yet he had walked right through the first engagement team and, to add insult to injury, simply walked right through the front gates. The elderly Hokage landed in a surprising feat of agility on a street he knew all too well, just like he knew every inch of the village that had been his home for 7 decades. At the other end, the very same man his troops were mobilizing for stood, a Junin Sarutobi knew to be called Hitomi Koyuki, held firmly in his grasp around the neck. The old man's gaze hardened when the Akatsuki member noticed him, callously snapping the neck of the Junin and almost absently casting her aside with incredible strength. "Ah, the Sandaime Hokage, I had wondered when you might appear before me." The man looked around to the crumpled form of the Junin behind him before returning his steely, even gaze to the legendary figure in front of him. "I must commend you, your shinobi refused to tell me anything on the whereabouts of the Jinchuriki. Perhaps it is not that they do not know, but rather you have kept it even from them." Hiruzen tensed as the man turned to fully face him, his full attention now on the much younger man. "What do you want, Akatsuki?" Hiruzen knew the answer was obvious, but he still thought it best to ask. Every second this man was occupied, his own forces had more time to prepare. "I want Naruto Uzumaki, he is instrumental in our plans." Hiruzen's eyes narrowed as a body that had not seen true combat in some time readied itself. "He is not in the village. He has not been for 10 years. The man's gaze didn't change, it seemed he was almost incapable of doing so. "We shall see. In your prime you were once called the god of shinobi. I would very much like to test that moniker." Sarutobi instinctively leapt back as the man slammed his hands into the ground and an enormous sealing matrix spread from the contact. The man practically radiated power and authority, and the barrier team had told him his chakra levels were just absurd. The wizened Hokage knew better than to underestimate such an opponent. However, what came out of that white cloud of smoke was no summon, but 6 other people, 5 more men with those same black piercings covering their body and a dispassionate blue-haired woman. All of them wore the Akatsuki cloak, and even more worryingly the 6 men each bore the Rinnegan. "We are pain. We are God. We will have the Kyuubi Jinchuriki." Naruto and Fu moved against the flow of evacuating civilians, the panicking men and women rushing past them in the direction shinobi were calling or pointing to. The 2 teens ignored their calls. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he moved in the direction of the massive, unfamiliar chakra he could feel. It had begun so suddenly, shinobi swarming up out of their positions on a seemingly invisible signal that Naruto actually knew to be hawk messengers. Then all of a sudden enormous and gruesome creatures began to spring up around the village, their arrival heralded by enormous clouds of white smoke. However, Naruto recognized the unusual summons with their black piercings, but more importantly their Rinnegan eyes. The leader of the Akatsuki had come to Konoha. Their Anbu guards had vanished, going off to help with the defense of the village against the unknown assailant. Even as Naruto thought this, Junin and Chunin were rushing towards each massive summon, hoping to take them down quickly so they could not do much damage to the village. Naruto knew that it was just a distraction though. The Akatsuki wanted him and Fu, they didn't care in the slightest about Konoha. The less shinobi in the way of their search the better, and the Rinnegan user could simply keep spawning summons to keep people occupied. Naruto, what are you doing? Naruto tried his best to ignore Kurama's voice in his head as he worked his chakra throughout his body, pushing it around and around as he felt the suppression seal get weaker and weaker. The fox growled angrily in his head as he felt his unrestrained chakra naturally move into the boy's freed-up coils, despite his best efforts to rein it in. If you continue to loosen the seal this quickly you could die. The fox's voice sounded more like a statement than genuine worry, but Naruto could still hear the slight confusion in the old Biju's tone. None of them are prepared for a Rinnegan user, they don't know what we can do. If I do nothing many people will likely die. His response was another growl as he and Fu made for the rooftops to speed along their journey. Even for these people, the ones who shunned you, you would throw away your own life. Naruto smirked inwardly as he sped up, once again feeling his chakra flow free and thick through his system. Who said anything about throwing away my life? Kurama was silent at that, but inwardly he huffed to himself, telling himself that he didn't care if the silly human got himself killed through his own feat of idiocy. However, as he felt his chakra move away from him and into the young blonde, a small twinge of something unidentifiable made itself known in the back of his mind. Fu, the Rinnegan user, wouldn't have come alone. Nobody could be so arrogant to think they could take on an entire hidden village by themselves, could they? I will handle the leader if I can. You deal with any other members of the Akatsuki you can. Fu nodded quickly. She understood that it wasn't Naruto thinking she couldn't hold her own, but she had seen firsthand how far out of her league a Rinnegan user could be. That didn't mean she would do her best to help the man she loved. This was quickly reinforced when Naruto stopped them on a random roof and turned to face her. Please, don't do anything to put yourself in danger if you can avoid it. Fu felt her heart flutter at the sheer concern and worry in the blonde's voice as he reached over to touch her gently on the stomach. At once she felt whatever effect the seal had over her fade, and her chakra rushed throughout her being like a veritable flood of energy. It wasn't as much as she was used to, and it was strange not to have that other source constantly tickling her senses, but she would manage, she had to. Only if you can promise the same. Naruto simply gave the girl a sad smile, both knowing that this would likely be the biggest challenge he had ever faced. He quickly pulled her into a hug, gently brushing back her hair on the other side of her head as he reveled in her warmth for a few moments. I will come back to you. Fu nodded, her eyes closed in an attempt to fully capture this moment, before Naruto pulled away and his warmth was gone. The girl took a moment on that empty rooftop to calm herself, readying her chakra and loosening up her muscles for what was to come. It was difficult, but if these people were in the way of a future where she and Naruto could be happy, then she had to succeed. Naruto knew he was in the right place as he passed over a completely destroyed building, nothing left of the once proud structure but rubble and debris. Dust clogged the air and the sounds of shinobi fending off the enormous summoned creatures rang throughout the air. When Naruto finally saw silhouettes through the dust, he readied himself, about to push past what was left of the suppression seal. However, as the dust cleared for a moment, the sight before him was enough to make him hesitate out of shock. Hiruzen Sarutobi, the Hokage, the man he could once call Gigi, was pinned to the ground, bloodied and beaten. An eerily familiar black rod was skewered through both his hand in a way that held them both in front of him. Next to him a man stood staring at the elderly Hokage, his long black cloak barely even tarnished and the red clouds still undamaged in the least. Slowly the man turned, his spiky orange hair, so similar to how Naruto's might have been without his ponytail, blew in the breeze. Steely gray Rinnegan eyes met vibrant purple ones, and for a moment it was as if the entire world stood still. Two sets of the most powerful dujutsu to have ever existed gazed at one another as perfect silence reigned. So you are the Kyuubi Jinchuriki, the other bearer of the sage's eyes. Naruto said nothing as his face slowly twisted into a completely emotionless mask, his hair falling forward to lightly shadow his eyes so that his own Rinnegan glowed ominously. I had wondered how a meeting between two gods would take place. Somehow in the shattered remains of the symbol of the old system seems appropriate. Naruto still remained silent as his chakra finished opening up the last of the suppression seal, much faster than was advisable. A near-visible glowing aura of chakra began to coalesce around him as the violent energies of the Kyuubi flooded his being. I had hoped we would have a chance to talk. Pain's eyes didn't even widen as his hand suddenly shot up at nearly the same moment as Naruto's as twin cries of the same technique resounded in the open space. Shinra. Tensai. Yagura had once used his water mirroring technique to replicate the effects of a Shinra Tensai, cancelling out Naruto's own use of the jutsu. However, Pain's was no replica, it wasn't even an inferior version, it was the same technique. However, the difference here was that it was being wielded by a man with much more practice and experience. The two waves of gravitational force met in between the two Rinnegan users, twisting the air, the very space around them, and blasting away the dust as the primordial forces opposed one another. A sudden shockwave surprised both men, forcing them to hunker low or be blown completely away by the sudden force. Naruto, the blonde, looked around, seeing Hiruzen look up at him wearily, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. He is not aloe. The warning would come too late though, as something landed in the space between the two men like a meteor. Before Naruto even got a good look at the newcomer, he was sprinting towards the blonde. All he saw before a crippling pain racked his body was another set of Rinnegan eyes, making his own widen in confusion before he was sent flying across the village. His eyes had captured every detail in that last second, so he could clearly remember the man with 6 arms, all of which looked unsettlingly mechanical, as he used all of them to punch him clean across the sky. It was something Naruto had himself done with the Asura path, using a piston at the elbow to create massive propelling force. However, those eyes, there were 2 Rinnegan users after him. He couldn't think about it much longer as he suddenly crashed straight through a wall some 3 stories up. As he lay there in the rubble he had created in his landing, he glanced about, seeing where he was. A choked, amused laugh couldn't help but roll off his tongue as he realized just where he had landed. The Pain with spiky hair glanced up at the building his opponent had flown into, the hospital. He had been about to enter to flush the Jinchuriki out only for the boy to do his job for him as he suddenly appeared in the very same hole he had created. Oddly enough though, the boy seemed to have changed his attire, donning a long red haori over a bare chest as well as a Magatama necklace composed of white beads, similar to the one now hanging in his ear. The most noticeable change though was the horned forehead protector with no symbol and the long wooden shakuju he now held in his hand. The two met eyes again as Naruto looked down on the Akatsuki member from 3 stories up, his haori moving in the wind and the bell in his hair tied tinkling softly with the breeze. Okay, now I'm ready. Chapter 84, Embers Part 8. I just want the weak, who do get swept along with the flow, be considered human as well, Annie Leonhardt. The sounds of fighting and explosions didn't seem to reach the two as they stared at one another, neither opting to make the first move. Both knew to be wary of their opponent because of the potential power that they both had, the limits of which had yet to be seen. Both had somewhat of an idea of what the other could do, but anything else was up to differing experiences and age. The Pain that had been sometimes designated as Tendo couldn't tear his gaze from the slightly different rippled eyes staring right back at him, and Naruto was equally enraptured by the sight. Both were so similar, yet the men behind those eyes couldn't have been ideologically farther apart. You are quite powerful, that much I can already tell. That blow would have killed most humans. Naruto's even gaze briefly flickered between a frown as he dropped from the hole he had made in the hospital, landing so the length of the street separated them. You speak as if you are not human. Tendo gave no sign he had even heard the question, his perpetually set expression of emotionlessness almost looking past the younger blonde. These eyes are not of mortals, you must have come to understand that by now. Our predecessor, the sage, was a god among men because of them. He was unrivaled even by the old gods of this world, casting them down so that man could flourish in their stead. In these eyes are the potential to exceed our mortal selves and become gods, that is what we are. When he said, we, Naruto had a feeling he wasn't just talking about the two of them, the image of that bald Rinnegan user springing to mind. Who are you then? Naruto couldn't tell from this distance, but something seemed a little off about the man in front of him, and it wasn't just his demeanor. The piercings through his body were unmistakably the same material as the chakra rods both of them used, the faint aura of chakra they gave off telling him that much. Was it some kind of intimidation tactic? We are Pain. We are God. Naruto's front only deepened with those words. It was like looking into a mirror of what he might have become without the guidance of the monks. This was a man who had been given power, only for it to go to his head in the worst possible way, giving him delusions of godhood. It's just a dujutsu, having more power does not make you any less human than I am. Finally the expression of the orange-haired Akatsuki changed as a light smirk crossed his features. It is amusing to hear you say that, considering you bear the very same eyes. Naruto fought back the scowl that wanted to tear over his features, instead opting to divert the conversation, buying more time for the shinobi of the village to rally themselves and evacuate civilians. He had a feeling that any fight between himself and this man wouldn't leave too much in its wake. Why are you even here? As I understand it, you have to seal the Kyuubi last. If the man seemed perturbed by Naruto's knowledge of the Akatsuki's plan, he didn't show it, instead he started to walk forward calmly. That is true, our plans will eventually require the sealing of the Biju contained within you. However, that is why I came personally, so I could speak to you, one heir of the sage to another. Naruto nearly faltered at that. All Pain came to find him for was to talk. About what? Our goals differ, we have nothing to talk about. It sounded very uncharacteristic coming from Naruto, considering his past history in trying to make peace through means other than violence. However, this man, the leader of the Akatsuki, he was what stood between him and Fu having a life together, undisturbed. If this man had even half of the determination in his own goals as Naruto did in his, then there could be no middle ground, no understanding wrought through words alone. That is not true. Tendo continued to walk forward, seemingly unconcerned with his surroundings as he didn't even glance about, always keeping his vision fixed on Naruto. Our goals are very much the same, the only difference is that I have a means to achieve what you are still struggling to understand. Naruto's confusion got the better of him and his eyes showed it as he blinked at the man walking towards him. What do you mean? The orange-haired Rinnegan wielder smirked again, his arms going wide as if to mock the very situation they stood in the midst of. Peace. At that, Naruto gritted his teeth as Kisami's answer to that same question rang through his mind. How could you preach about peace standing in the very midst of an attack you instigated? Innocent lives are being lost because of what you are doing right now. Pain's smirk slipped away as his face once again lost any semblance of emotion. Understanding between men is such a fleeting dream, happening so rarely and so tenuously that it is almost fated to snap. However, beings such as me and you know that fate holds no sway over us. True understanding is only created when people share pain, when they all share the loss and suffering dealt to them. Then and only then, will there be peace. It took a moment for his words to register with Naruto before many things began to click into place and a scowl slowly formed on his usually serene face. So that's it. Your answer is fear. You would have men cower at the consequences of their own actions, tamed by horror and the shared pain of thousands. Pain stopped a short distance from the blonde, barely 10 meters separating the two bearers of the legendary eyes. No. The answer surprised Naruto momentarily, but it didn't last long. The shared pain of millions. At this his voice was quiet, but it echoed so clearly in the street that it seemed to reverberate in the monk's mind. The Biju will be combined into a weapon so terrible that even one use of it will tear apart entire nations. Men will fear its use and its use against them, and war will end because that pain will be understood by all. Naruto's hand slowly clenched into fists as the thin aura of chakra that had been surrounding his body since the seal had been released grew, flickering as though translucent flames had consumed his body. Such a peace could only be temporary, and worthless at the cost of so many lives. Pain didn't acknowledge the last part, he didn't even seem to hear it. Yes, man will eventually forget that pain, they will cease to understand one another given time, but then the weapon will be used again and they will remember. Naruto fought to control himself, to rein in the rampaging chakra of the Kyuubi that he could feel was subtly influencing his emotions toward the more negative spectrum. You call that peace? That is not peace. That is nothing more than an interlude between wars more catastrophic than anything that has come before. What you call peace, I call using genocide to punish those that don't obey your rules and holding the threat over those too afraid to defy you. Pain regarded the blonde for a moment, noting the intense energies surrounding him. Peace, even for a time, is better than this perpetual shinobi world we have right now. Is it not appropriate that I use the Biju for this? The very creatures the sage himself created will become the tool that ushers in a new, better era. A peace that could last generations before the next installment of the weapon. Naruto stopped shuddering with rage as he became eerily still, his hair coming forward to shadow his eyes and the aura of chakra receding into his body. When he looked up again, his Rinnegan had changed slightly. Tomo now slowly rotated the small pupil, looking as though one was missing in the innermost ring. They were faint and almost imperceptible. Pain didn't even see them himself. Your piece is nothing but a false one. Your methods are beyond inhumane. You stand here and preach about being a god as you callously slaughter the shinobi of this village. You call the Biju nothing more than tools for your use out of a sense of vicarious entitlement. All of this, and you ask me to accept what you are doing. Pain's eyes narrowed slightly as the energy around the blonde seemingly dissipated. However, he knew better. It had simply condensed within him, flooding his coils and surging through his system. Arms suddenly burst from the ground beneath Naruto, 6 to be precise, and each one made to grab the blonde's legs. However, at the same moment the blonde jumped up, twisting his body as the air around his feet shifted due to the intense heat of his high-no-mai and the fire-natured chakra channeled there. He struck 2 of the arms faster than they could react, shearing straight through the metallic appendages like they were made of mud instead of metal. The others quickly vanished back into the ground, and a moment later that same bald Rinnegan user burst from the earth next to the original, who seemed nonplussed his ambush had failed. It is such a shame that you reject me. Working together, as 2 sons of the sage, we could never have been stopped. However, as powerful as you think you are nothing more than a child, barely understanding just what it is you carry. You will quickly fall before God. Naruto said nothing. Instead, his body seemed to shimmer for a moment before rushing forward, surprising both teens with his speed. However, it was only momentary before Naruto was once again forced into the air by a low sweeping kick. He landed on the side of a building, looking on in mild confusion as a third man joined the fray. He too had orange hair, but it was slicked back and he was bulkier than the other 2 teens. However, he still had the same black chakra rod piercings littering his face, and likely his body, as well as another set of cold Rinnegan eyes. Naruto stayed there, crouched against the side of the wall in short contemplation before his eyes narrowed slightly. 3 huh? Where are the other 3 then? Tendo raised his brow slightly, wondering if the boy had managed to figure out his secret so quickly, then again considering who he was it wasn't too surprising. Naruto could see it though. It had taken him a moment to understand what it was he was actually witnessing, but this brought it into focus. He had noticed the strange way Tendu's chakra seemed to move, as if it were being forced along by the rods implanted in his body. However, the one with 6 arms had a coating of chakra over his entire body, like when Naruto used the Asura path, so he couldn't see if it was the same. It was only with the arrival of this third Rinnegan user, with chakra flow similar to the first, that Naruto could understand what was going on, and be properly disgusted by it. How could you pervert these bodies in such a way? Somehow Pain had managed to use the chakra receivers as a way to manually manipulate the chakra system of a dead body, almost like a puppet. Naruto knew they were dead because he could see no chakra in their coils, only what was being pumped around by the rods. If that was true, then it was also likely they shared their eyesight like Naruto did with his clones, however they would be nowhere near as weak. The 3 teens however simply stared at him, as if regarding the question. It was almost creepy how they all looked in unison. They better serve God now. This only made Naruto angrier. He wasn't even fighting the real Pain, just these puppets that seemed to have access to his powers. However, at the same time this frightened him. He could feel the power of these men and it was nothing to scoff at. If the original was an amalgam of them all, then he must be a terrifying opponent. The third one to join suddenly dropped a chakra rod from his sleeve and rushed forward, wielding the stick like a sword. Naruto leapt forward to meet him, Shikuju at the ready. He hated to use it as a weapon, but right now he could hold nothing back. However, it didn't take him long to realize going into close combat with one of these puppets was a bad idea, even one-on-one. They were fast, strong and left absolutely no openings. The shared vision saw to that. He could feel himself being quickly overpowered as he twirled his staff to block a strike that would have skewered through his arm, no doubt disrupting the chakra flow in that limb. He was surprised then when the large man suddenly discarded the rod and leapt forward, looking as though he were attempting to crush Naruto to death. The blonde realized what was about to happen just in time for a long extendable metal tail, almost like a scorpion, to flash from behind his robes, driving the larger man away. Once again Naruto looked across the 3 teens, each staring back at him coldly as he counted it off in his mind. Gravity, metal limbs and weapons, and attempt to get close to siphon my chakra. Each of them is a path. Armed with this knowledge, Naruto knew he had to be facing the Diva, Asura, and Preta paths, which meant the other three were somewhere still in the village, or nearby, keeping a watch on the fight and providing more viewpoints. In the brief respite he gained with the surprise of the tail, Naruto reached out through the water vapor in the air, gaining a small smirk as he found what he was looking for. He immediately spun on one foot, already fanning his chakra into a broiling inferno within his lungs, concentrating it and expanding it until Kaden. Naruto did something he had never really attempted before in combat, never having the right instruction. In this case he simply decided to wing it as he sent violent fire chakra to his lungs before blowing it out as a white-hot stream of pure flame. The result was, a bit more than Naruto expected. A veritable tidal wave of burning fire rushed down a nearby darkened alleyway, spilling out into the street beyond and flowing right over the buildings there. He quickly cut off the makeshift jutsu before he razed the entire district, his eyes noting the small form that emerged from the smoke. A fourth pain entered his line of sight as it landed on a nearby rooftop, his long orange hair forming two bangs. Its robes were burned and smoldering, but it seemed otherwise fine. However, that didn't matter to Naruto. He had gained what he needed. If each pain could use all the abilities of the Rinnegan, it would have simply absorbed the flames, which meant they were limited to one each. However, now Pain really had the numbers advantage, which he made no waste off as the four paths suddenly rushed in close to Naruto. The only thing that prevented the blonde from getting a nasty beating from the near perfectly choreographed attack was his staff, which he was able to use to keep them from getting too close. However, a shikuju was no offensive weapon, and against the tough paths it might as well have been a stick. None of them held still long enough for him to try and subvert their chakra through it, and they were too skilled in taijutsu to really let his strength come to bear. It seemed like a stalemate between them, quickly becoming a battle of attrition which seemed unfavorable to Naruto. However, Pain made a mistake when Shirato chose to take advantage of Naruto's blind spot, cracking down on the back of the blonde's head with four of his arms. What he wasn't expecting was for two more arms to suddenly rise out of the blonde's shoulders, catching the powerful hammer drop. The ground underneath the blonde buckled and cratered from the immense pressure exerted by the blow, but the monk didn't yield, a slightly animalistic grin appearing on his features. "What, do you think only you knew that trick?" Taking advantage of the opportunity that had finally presented itself, the two mechanical arms that belonged to the blonde suddenly lashed out, grabbing a hold of Shirato by the shoulders. With a massive roar of exertion that bulged out the muscles along the blonde's chest, he ripped Pain's Asura path clean in half. He felt no sorrow for the destruction of the already perverted body, especially when only machinery fell from inside of it. Throughout all of this, Naruto never even looked at the bald path once, confusing Pain as to how he had known when it was clearly in the monk's blind spot. Clones. Tendo seemed contemplative as the remaining three paths moved back. He figured Naruto must have been using clones with shared sight to cover his blind spots. It felt admittedly strange to have his own technique used against him like that. At the same time, he felt oddly satisfied that Naruto was this powerful. While he was thinking, though, the blonde took the opportunity to assess his own situation. Already he was struggling, and Pain hadn't even been using all of his paths. He wouldn't fall for the same trick twice, so he had to be careful now. He calmed himself, seeking to gather in nature chakra to that if it did become a matter of attrition he would have the advantage. Naruto stopped. He paused before he could begin taking in the natural energy, scowling as Kurama intervened at a particularly inopportune time. "I'm very busy right now, Kurama." His eyes and those of the invisible clones he had hidden around the street were darting about for any signs of the other paths entering the fight. "Do not attempt to use senjutsu right now, it is too dangerous. I cannot predict what the two different energies will do inside of you." Naruto frowned, his muscles still uncomfortably tensed as both sides waiting for the other to make a move. "That's what you said about your own chakra, and I feel fine, better than fine actually." It was true, far from the ripping pain he had been expecting. With the Kyuubi's unrestrained chakra raging through his system, he felt faster and stronger than usual. "No, if you do not find some way to restrain yourself soon, my chakra will tear your body apart. Already it is placing far too much stress on your muscles. You need to calm yourself and focus on control right now, or you will die." Naruto almost faltered at the Kyuubi's words, not having realized what was going on inside of him. It's not like I have a choice. If I falter for even a moment, pain will have the opportunity to end this and you will all be in danger." A low growl ripped through his head as Kurama expressed his displeasure. "Yes, and as much as I would like to see this pretender lying in a pool of his own blood before you, it will be utterly pointless if you kill yourself in the process." Naruto scowled at that, knowing the Kyuubi was right. However, there was little he could do about it as Pain finally decided they had been waiting too long. Unfortunately for him, Naruto had come to the same conclusion, and as the three paths moved to surround him, chains suddenly burst out of the ground beneath them. This time Tendu's eyes seemed to widen in genuine surprise as the vicious-looking implements moved to surround the three in perfect sync. Even Naruto was a little surprised as the chains were no longer their usual black color, but a shining, almost silvery gray that gave them an almost ethereal appearance as they moved. To bind Pain's puppets. None of them were paralyzed by surprise for too long, and before the chains could touch flesh, Tendo blasted them back with an omnidirectional Shinra Tensei, using the opening to leap away from them. Gakido and Ninjendo were not so lucky though, each one getting tangled up in the thick, powerful chains. After a moment though, they simply seemed to fade away from the larger of the two. The one Naruto knew had to hold the prey to path, so Naruto quickly cut the connection to them before more of his chakra could be siphoned. However, he wasted no time in using the chains to completely rip the other one apart. He didn't risk just breaking its neck as he would have preferred, as he couldn't be sure in what condition they could still be controlled. All the same, neither he nor his clones chose to look as the puppet body was brutally ripped apart, but they could all feel it. Two down. However, if either of the remaining two peens seemed irritated or concerned by the losses, they didn't show it. The chains continued to wave around threateningly, like the tentacles of some great underground beast. The peens seemed wary to approach for now, but eventually they would think of a plan or realize that for Naruto to use them from the ground, he had to send them out through his feet, so he couldn't actually move right now. Once again they were in a stalemate. Fu ran as fast as she could across the rooftops of Konoha, just another blur lost among the hundreds of other shinobi dashing about in their frenzy. Occasionally what looked to be a weak glow of chakra tried to form on her back, in between her shoulder blades, however only moments later it would die again. She was trying to form her chakra wings only for them to flicker and fade away before they were even substantial. Throughout the week she had been preparing herself for the possibility she would lose the ability, but as it was happening she couldn't help but feel frustrated at their loss. They had both been a major part of her fighting style and a great source of freedom for her. The only positive she could take away was the fact that at least something is attempting to form, even if it was weak and insubstantial. It gave her hope that in the future she might be able to replicate the technique on her own, without Chome there to help her with it. Right now though, it just took too much concentration and energy, things she didn't have at the moment, as she rushed towards the nearest massive summon, what appeared to be a 5-story tall ox. It was ignoring the many jutsu being thrown at it by the multitude of shinobi on the nearby streets and rooftops. Instead it continued to plow through the many buildings in its way, carving a swath of destruction through the village that seemed unstoppable. If Fu had been taught anything in her time with Naruto, it was that nothing was unstoppable. As she ran, long, crisp swords of water grew from her hands, her speed picking up as she pumped more and more chakra into her legs until it became almost dangerous. She might never have the control to try and replicate Tsunade's strength like Naruto could, but she could definitely grasp the fundamentals and use it in her own way. As she reached the edge of the building, chakra began to saturate her core, aiding her body as she kicked off the edge with incredible speed and strength, spinning the point where her voice sounded distorted and strange. Suiten. Tsubasa no Kaden. She became nothing more than a bluish-green rotating blur in what many mistook to be an Inuzuka's passing fang technique. However, her speed and rotation, plus the razor-sharp edges of her water blades, was more than enough to carry her straight through the throat of the enormous summon. It dispelled a moment later into an equally large cloud of white smoke before she even touched the ground. Many shinobi were confused when they saw what they assumed to be a comrade touch down after defeated the summon in one move, only to quickly dash off before they could be congratulated or thanked. However, as Fu was moving towards another of the summons, in the hopes she might find another Akatsuki member, her path was blocked off by a wall of shuriken. However, as she leapt to the side to avoid them, she noticed they were different than normal, namely they were white and seemed to be made out of paper. She glanced warily around for where the barrage came from, only to catch out of the corner of her eye as the shuriken all twisted about in midair in a physically impossible move, at least had they simply been thrown. A moment later and they all unfolded, revealing them to be origami-like structures that flocked together. So you are the Nanabi Jinchuriki. Out of the swirling vortex of papers stepped a woman with blue hair and startlingly similar amber eyes to Fu. However, she wore an Akatsuki cloak, which was all Fu needed as far as a target went. Keeping in mind what she had already seen, Fu dashed forward, moving with speed that actually managed to surprise the woman even if her face didn't show it. However, her shock was only external as Fu realized her mistake too late. Her water swords cleaved right through the woman, or at least her facsimile, and only milliseconds later Fu caught sight of the hidden kanji inscribed on more than a few of the paper sheets. From the next building over, Conan watched dispassionately as the entire rooftop was consumed by flame. To be honest, she had been expecting more from the Nanabi Jinchuriki. While she didn't think much of Deidara, he was still a capable fighter and he had earned his S-ranked title. Yet for the girl to fall for such an obvious ploy was almost insulting to her as a serious kunoichi. A moment later though, and a smirk crossed the woman's lips, quickly dipping to the side to avoid a slash that easily cut through the roof tiles they were standing on. She turned to face Fu, not even a single singe on the caramel-skinned girl's body, and nodded in approval. Good, I'm sure Pain-sama will be busy for a few minutes with the Kyuubi. I have time to deal with you. Fu said nothing as her eyes narrowed, both women readying themselves. Naruto now regretted the elation he had felt for his victories earlier as he defended repeated strikes from a perfectly synchronized assault on four fronts. Not soon after dealing with Ninjendo, the other two peons had come out of the woodwork, seamlessly integrating with the others in order to bring him down. His chains only offered him so much utility when he used them in open combat, as with their shared vision the peons were almost impossible to sneak up on, and if he tried a sneak attack he would be rooted in place and susceptible to Gakido or Tendo. All the while Chikushudo and the one he assumed to be the outer path, given what he knew about his own Rinnegan, hounded him from the sidelines. Shinra Tensai. When he felt overwhelmed he tried to release an enormous blast of energy to clear him some room. However, that seemed to be precisely what Pain was waiting for as the four men moved as one, all of them dashing behind Tendo, who swiftly raised his hand. Shinra Tensai. His calm voice sounded out above the sound of rubble being thrown around as a second wall of force rose to meet the first. Once again the two identical attacks collided with one another, rippling the air until they imploded, causing a shockwave to wash over everybody. In that same instant though, Tendo raised his other hand as Gakido moved round to stand next to him. Bansho Tenin. Naruto's eyes widened, in recognition at the technique's name, as he was suddenly lifted off the ground and sent hurtling towards the two men. Instinctively chains shot from his back, digging deep into the ground in order to anchor him so that he was almost comically stuck flailing in midair. However, this seemed planned for two as Gakido darted forward, crossing the distance between them faster than he had moved before. On reflex, Naruto's arm suddenly shifted and contorted until it better resembled a thin metallic barrel that instantly charged up with blinding light. He realized his mistake too late as he released the blast of concentrated chakra, only for Gakido to raise his arm almost casually and absorb the blast, continuing his charge unperturbed. At the last moment though, when it appeared Gakido was about to reach him to absorb his chakra, a great tendril of sand suddenly burst from the earth at their feet. It slammed into the orange-haired brute so fast that he couldn't even be warned in time by the shared vision, tossing him across the street and crushing him mercilessly against a nearby wall until that too was nothing but rubble and dust. Tendo raised an eyebrow at this, already having known Naruto possessed this ability and had simply been wondering when he would choose to use it. The Bansho Tenin wore off and Naruto dropped to the ground thankfully, the chains retracting with the speed of a whip. Sand now writhed around him ominously as the blonde figured he might as well use it if the surprise was gone. However, it seemed he wasn't the only one with surprises, as when Pain stepped forward it wasn't just with the three Naruto had thought he had left, but with five. The blonde widened his eyes in surprise when Shirato and Ninjendo joined the ranks of their fellow paths again, looking for all the world completely undamaged. When he checked through one of his clones he saw the two places they had been lying, broken, were completely empty, void of even blood. You cannot defeat us, Naruto Uzumaki, we are Pain. A hint of worry entered the blonde's mind as he took a single step back, only to bump into something behind him. He whirled around, a black chakra rod forming in his hand in an instant, However, his wrist was caught in a steel embrace that he could already feel his chakra being siphoned away into as he looked up at the expressionless face of the last F the six peens, also undamaged. We are God. Chapter 85, Embers Part 9. Those that are used to looking down on others often forget to look up. Proverb. Conan exploded into thousands of sheets of paper, each moving in random, evasive ways as she scattered back from an explosive kick from the young mint-haired girl that left a sizable crater in the roof below them. Conan was slightly disconcerted with the girl's speed and strength, simply unnatural for a girl her size and age. She wondered if this was the influence of the girl's bijou, but she hadn't yet seen any sign of its presence. That too was strange, as with all the reports they had gathered from Black Zetsu, the girl was described as using her tenant's chakra almost liberally. Right now Conan would have preferred that, then she could simply distract the girl with paper clones and diversionary tactics until she ran out of energy or was too injured from her biju's chakra. However, as the papers that made up her body scurried out of the way of another vicious slash of the girl's surprisingly dangerous water swords, Conan didn't think that was likely to happen anytime soon. A smirk crossed the older woman's face though as she floated back, forcing Fu to jump across a street-wide gap to land on the adjacent building. However, mid-roll her orange eyes opened wider in surprise as the very floor she was standing on suddenly came alive as exploding tags that had previously been camouflaged against the tiles snapped up to try and surround her body. Conan forced down the smirk as she watched the explosion that completely leveled the building rise high into the sky from above it, keeping a wary amber eye for any sign of movement. It was only this vigilance that allowed her to quickly spin her body to the side, using her papery wings to propel herself away as a small shadow descended on her from above. True to her previous nature as an assassin and ruthlessly trained killer, Fu dropped down on the just barely aware Akatsuki without a whisper of sound. As she landed in a tight roll on another building, cautious for more traps, both women took a moment to take stock of the situation, knowing right now they were just going in circles with one another. Those shadow clones are a rather irritating ability, I must admit. It was mostly due to the fact they were indistinguishable from the original, meaning even the mint-haired girl she was talking to now could simply be another clone. They have their uses. At least Conan could respect the mindset of the teen she was fighting. Like her, she was level-headed in conflict. Also like her, she was the faithful companion of a Rinnegan user. The parallels were actually rather disturbing when looked at too deeply, so the Bluenet didn't. Are you not going to ask me my motives? Try to convince me that what I am doing is wrong. From what I understand, that is what your group tends to do, is it not? Fu's gaze remained level as she kept her senses on alert for any underhanded tactics. The woman was a shinobi after all. I am not Naruto. I am more than willing to do the things he purposefully limits himself from doing if it means keeping him safe. Briefly, a spark of true respect alighted in Conan's eyes before she quashed it with the rest of her emotion, setting her mind instead to the task of just what Fu was buying time for with all these clones. Something that took this long to prepare would either be very powerful, or the girl was accounting for as many tactical possibilities as possible in whatever trap she was preparing. I can admire your commitment, but I must also be faithful to my own. Pain's wishes are my own. Faster than Fu could react, the papers around Conan's hand swirled, coiling tightly into a long and viciously tipped spear that the woman instantly threw. The former Jinchuriki had no chance against the spear propelled by both Conan's strength and her chakra-enhanced paper. It struck her right through the shoulder, only missing her heart thanks to what reflexes Fu could actually muster. She just wasn't able to compare to Conan's more honed speed thanks to the woman's age. However, only moments later the girl smirked lightly, her job done as she burst into a cloud of clean white smoke. Thank you for giving me time for this. I never was as good as the others at it. The paper user spun in the air, latching onto the new voice until she spotted another Fu standing on a nearby rooftop. Conan wasn't sure how she knew, but this one was definitely no clone. She just seemed different, even if it was hard to put a finger on why. Paper swirled violently around her hand again, this time into a large windmill shuriken, but she launched it with that same deadly speed like she had predicted. Fu leapt up and over the slightly slower moving projectile. However, Conan allowed herself a brief smirk as a second shuriken revealed itself in the shadow of the first. Her lips almost immediately turned down, though when instead of the expected sound of flesh being cut open there was only a dull tap. Fu had reached out in midair and caught the razor-sharp edge of the paper weapon so quickly it didn't even reach her palm. Not only But she managed to do it all without actually looking up once, and Conan quickly understood why when she finally saw the girl's eyes. They practically glowed with the ominous color of molten gold. You possess a form of sage mode like Jiraiya-sensei. Almost as if to punctuate that statement, both women felt the tremors behind them as in the distance an enormous toad buried its equally large sword into the ground in an attempt to deal with one of Pain's summons. True to her words though, Fu had undergone a slight change beyond the change to her eyes. Two thick red lines traced the edges of her nose on both sides before curving around beneath her eyes, following the contours of her face down her cheekbones and tailing off into elegant flicks on her neck. The space around and above her eyes had also turned the same red, heightening the much more exotic appearance of her eyes. One moment Fu was looking up at her with those intense yellow eyes, the next she blurred out of view, appearing not even a moment later in front of the woman, hand drawn back and crackling with lightning chakra. However, Conan realized it was a diversion too late as he brought a few of her papers around as a makeshift shield. The younger girl twisted her body in a way many wouldn't have considered possible, using her now downward momentum to bring her foot up and over the Akatsuki member and swiftly bring it down in a senjutsu-enhanced axe kick. The two separated again, Conan reeling from the brutal attack and Fu managing to gracefully flip back onto the street. However, at the same instant her foot touched the ground, it once again came alive as hundreds of sheets of paper latched onto her. She couldn't even jump away as the little white sheets secured her to the floor, allowing more and more to flock onto her body until she was entirely encased in paper like some strange makeshift statue in the middle of the street. The vedette tried in vain to flex her muscles and move even a little, even as she felt her oxygen slowly running out, but the almost concrete hard papers offered no leverage whatsoever, preventing her from bringing her nature chakra-enhanced strength into play. Hundreds of little origami birds flocked together in the street in front of the immobilized girl, quickly forming Conan's body, or at least half of it, as the woman chose to hover a few feet off the ground, her wings spread out to either side like the angel Omegakure considered her to be. She made an almost absent gesture to call in more papers to finish capturing the girl. The only thing to do now was to wait for the girl to pass out from oxygen deprivation. However, the woman was caught off guard as two green constructs suddenly burst from the paper cocoon, slicing through the reinforced sheets like they were tissue paper. The two insectoid wings buzzed experimentally once before moving in a flurry of frenzied action, using their razored edges to neatly slice through the girl's confines. A moment later and Fu was free again, taking in large, thankful gulps of air as her new wings buzzed excitedly behind her, sometimes spasmodically as if they were unsure of what they should be doing. After a moment both women got their bearings, returning to glaring at one another as the newly winged Fu began experimental flapping her wings. Unfortunately for her, without the Nanabi at least partially controlling the appendages, she found it much more difficult than normal. The only reason she had even this much control was purely prior experience, not to mention the sheer concentration it took to maintain them, even with senjutsu giving her more focus. "Those little wings will not help you here, girl." Fu ignored her, knowing that if it came to a battle of air supremacy the much more experienced Akatsuki member would likely have the advantage. Instead she flashed through a set of long hand signs, already jumping back and using her new wings for a small boost to prevent Conan from stopping her. Naturally the blue-haired woman raised her hand, calling forth a veritable stream of razor-thin papers to flood the girl, going for quantity to try and overwhelm the girl's newfound power-up. Still, she couldn't help but raise an eyebrow as the first light patterings of rain began to fall around her, sliding harmlessly off her body. From the look in her opponent's eyes she could tell this was the result of the girl's jutsu, a smart move, but Conan was long beyond that weakness. "Rain. You believe water will help you here?" Conan's eyes hardened, actually feeling herself a little insulted. Her enemy had at least proved herself to be intelligent and forward-thinking. "I believe the time has come for me to stop playing around." The previously bulky paper wings on Conan's back seemed to compress for a moment, becoming thinner and more like those of an angel, with defined feathers even. Shikigami no Mai. The two wings took one powerful backstroke, creating a large wall of pressure that shattered windows behind the woman and launched her forward, just a white and blue blur. Even Fu's sage-enhanced sense couldn't keep up with the veritable bullet of a woman as she flew past, creating another shockwave as he fist met Fu's stomach. There was no reprieve though, as when Fu looked down she saw a single sheet of blue paper latched onto her chest. In mere moments she was completely surrounded by what could only be described as a tornado of paper. It reached into the sky, dwarfing some of the summons around it as the thousands of sheets that composed it did their work, slicing and cutting into the sage-enhanced girl. Each one was nothing more than a shallow, thin cut, but there were so many, from every direction, that Fu just couldn't keep up with them all. From above, Conan cancelled her technique, allowing the papers to disperse and seemingly vanish when in fact she had them lie in wait in case the girl was not defeated yet. The rain around them had stopped, no doubt from the former Jinchuriki losing her focus, and the brunette used that as her cue to descend on the girl, gracefully hanging in the air before her opponent. Fu felt as bad as she looked, covered in blood from the hundreds or thousands of cuts that littered her body. Slowly the red marks around her eyes faded and the irises returned to their normal orange. However, as her would-be captor approached, she couldn't help but smile, eliciting a small pause from Conan as she suspected a trap. Conan frowned at the weak voice, approaching a little closer so she could hear the girl's strained whisper, that smile infuriating her to no end. "I knew, you were from Omegakure." Fu just about managed to get that out, feeling faint from blood loss but managing to keep herself together long enough to do what she needed. Conan pondered the strange phrase for a moment, trying to work out the girl's final taunt, only for her eyes to open wider in realization. If the girl had known she was from AIM, then why use a technique to simulate rain? Unless, Katsu. Conan looked up far too late to see Fu's hands weakly clasped in the tiger seal, the thousands of tiny glittering specks across her body that had been carried onto her by each individual raindrop glowing and hissing ominously. Quickly, triage procedures everybody, come on. Tsunade huffed, blowing a stray strand of her long blonde hair away from her eyes as she glanced around the makeshift medical area. Naturally, the hospital was a prime spot for attacks during the invasion, so this area had been set up as quickly as possible to deal with the sudden influx of injured or incapacitated shinobi. Around her the medical ninjas scurried about, prioritizing and treating patients the best they could while an entire company of Anbu stood vigilantly nearby as guards. Her head flashed up as the ground beneath her rocked slightly, a warm gust of air blowing past her as the surrounding ninjas steadied themselves. In the near distance a small plume of flame rose into the sky before petering out, just a rain of dust and smoke to mark the explosion. Tsunade quickly put it out of her mind, d'espier the strange nagging sensation she was feeling, and concentrated at the task at hand as she looked back down at the unconscious body in front of her. Damn it, Kakashi, just what did this to you? The elite Junin was in a tenuous situation, suffering from severe chakra depletion as well as blood loss from the multiple impalements. She was still making efforts just to remove the strange black rods and not send the poor man into shock. Momentarily she felt a flutter of worry for her idiot of a teammate, but quashed it, knowing Jiraiya was strong enough to handle himself here. However, as she looked up to see a small sandstorm raging in what appeared to be the center of the village, she knew who it was she was really worried for. Pain missed the small flash of a smirk crossing Naruto's face before the Gakido was sent hurtling back through the wall behind the blonde and three more in its path. The only indication Naruto had done anything was the palm he had facing towards the larger puppet. If Pain was surprised by the wordless Shinra Tensei, though he certainly didn't show it, his paths instead moving to try and surround the blonde, only for said monk to chuckle lightly. The civilians have finished evacuating. He could feel it through his water sense. The only signatures anywhere in the near vicinity were higher-leveled ones like Anbu. He had wondered why no Konoha shinobi had intervened in their fight yet, but he presumed between protecting their injured Kage, fending off the giant summons, and making sure the genin weren't placing themselves in immediate danger, the village ultimately had its hands full. After all, Konoha was not expecting the attack, so a large portion of its forces were out on missions or in the surrounding regions on patrol, too far away to be of any help. Good. Naruto flexed his hand, the sand around his feet twitching as if called, that means I don't have to worry about them anymore. The sand began to whirl more violently as the five paths in front of him eyed him carefully, trying to prepare for whatever was about to happen. However, as the sand blasted outward, swirling in a maelstrom of tiny, grating particles, they could do nothing but raise their arms to shade their eyes. One of them noticed that around them the walls were being noticeably ground away by the furiously swirling sandstorm, eliciting all of them to jump up to try and escape the unnatural phenomena. They missed it then, with their obscured lines of sight, when thick black chains simply appeared before them from nowhere, instantly impaling 3 of the paths before any of them knew quite what was happening. Internally all of the Peens scowled as one of them, the pain with the squared jaw and spiky hair, was speared straight through the head, instantly making the puppet inoperable. Naruto had undermined a large portion of their strategy without even realizing, not to mention taking out Chikushodo and Ninjendo in the same attack, effectively having Pain's numbers. At the same time though, it allowed him to divert more chakra into the remaining 3, strengthening them enough that Tendo was able to bat the chain aside and Shirato was able to separate his torso from his legs by a long metal cable, dodging the chain. Both grabbed their respective chains in unison, pulling them forward and grabbing the neck of the invisible Naruto clones behind them before mercilessly crushing them into smoke. Tendo grunted in mild annoyance as he looked around fruitlessly, unable to see anything at all within the localized sandstorm, and despite the body's inability to feel pain, he knew that slowly the skin was being ground away at, limiting its capability. He raised a hand, blowing back a massive portion of the sand to try and clear his vision, incidentally leveling a nearby building beneath his notice. His eyes widened though in visible surprise as a shadow descended over him, growing alarmingly in size as he looked up to see an arm-like structure of sand coming down to flatten him. Bansho Tenon. The orange-haired Akatsuki suddenly flew out of the way of the arm, his body jerking unnaturally as he was attracted to a nearby structure that trembled as the sand arm crushed the ground behind him. He flipped and landed feet first on the wall, cratering it from the impact before standing there horizontally, calmly looking for any sign of his blonde-haired opponent. He was lucky Shirato had survived the onslaught of the chains, as not a moment later the Asura path-using bald Akatsuki managed to catch a beam of pure white energy in their shared vision that Pain recognized all too well. A crushing impact in front of him from Gakido falling from the sky saved him though, as the larger puppet opened its arms out wide, absorbing all of the chakra from the blast as all 3 Peens looked towards its obvious source. It made Naruto narrow his eyes slightly as his arm disassembled and reassembled itself back into a normal hand again. He quickly raised a palm, blocking a series of powerful explosions above him with an invisible wall of force, still feeling the intense heat from the small but dangerous projectiles launched from Shirato's arm. Not a moment later Gakido came barreling out of the smoke, dodging the chains and sand Naruto sent at him with far more speed and agility than it had shown before. The two locked hands as a look of small satisfaction crossed the orange-haired puppet's face, only for it to drop as it felt nothing happening. When it tried to draw out chakra from the younger blonde, it felt some kind of resistance. Its eyes only opened wider in alarm when it felt its own chakra slowly begin to get drawn out against its will. Realizing the situation, it tried to use what it assumed to be its greater strength to throw the boy closer to the other Peens, only to find itself unable to move. Naruto quickly overpowered the much larger man thanks to the strength he had inherited from Tsunade, holding him there as he locked eyes with the puppet, making sure that wherever the real Pain was he could see him clearly. These are nothing more than empty puppets with a poor facsimile of our power. As long as you hide behind them you won't beat me. A third arm grew out of the monk's shoulder, quickly reconstructing itself into an awfully familiar and complicated tube-like shape before it glowed a bright blue, and Pain saw nothing else from that path. Naruto allowed the now headless puppet to slump to the side, a little sickened by the fact he had just had to witness a grown man have his head completely disintegrated by a blast of concentrated chakra. Their fight had moved towards the edges of the village now, towards the cliff that bore the Hokage monument, and Naruto could clearly see the path of destruction it had wrought through the streets. He didn't get time to look for very long before a wall of sand sprung up beside him, blocking off a sharp metal tail that was trying to bisect his body. He jumped back from the flurry of mechanical fists that tried to further the damage, only to swing through air. Moments later Shirato found itself surrounded on both sides by 2 Naruto clones that had seemingly phased out of thin air, both with their hands towards it and their eyes cold. Shinra Tensai. However, before the rippling waves of force could rend the mechanical path apart or crush it flat, its body was violently yanked away, as if he had been plucked by some great invisible string. The 2 clones, in their surprise, were not fast enough to dodge the 2 chakra rods that swiftly implanted in their neck courtesy of Tendo, leaving Naruto standing alone against the 2 Peens. At that moment though, a great blast rippled through the village, causing Naruto to look over to where a great plume of fire and smoke was reaching towards the sky. Pain quickly saw his opportunity as Shirato crouched down, the top of its head seemingly unfolding to reveal a strange metallic hole that seemed unsettlingly similar to the chakra cannon Naruto could manifest in his arm, only bigger. He was proved right as the puppet's head began to glow blindingly bright before an enormous blast of energy roared out of the weapon. The ground underneath its path was torn asunder as windows that had somehow survived the previous onslaughts shattered completely. Naruto literally had no time other than to raise his arm, his eyes wide with the sheer magnitude of the blast, to proportions he had never even tried, even in Sage mode. As the puppets were being whittled down and Pain's chakra was distributed more evenly, they each became more and more dangerous. So blinded by the corona of pure energy engulfing his view, even as he drained it into himself, he missed Tendo raise his hand, his eyes rippling with energy. Shinra Tensai. Shirado never stopped firing, not giving Naruto time to mount a defense as the poor monk was hit full force with the catastrophic attack, lifting him up and sending him careening through the air. He desperately tried to right himself, but he was too disoriented from the wave of force to think clearly. He had even managed to reinforce his skin with Doden chakra and the Asura path, but it still felt like being hit with a truck, or one of Suon's untempered punches. He rolled painfully to a stop after crashing through more than a few trees, now well on the outskirts of Konoha, to the point where the surrounding forest completely hid the village from his view. A tree next to him exploded as Shirado made its presence known, blasting into the clearing with what appeared to be jets of flame roaring out of its feet for propulsion. Naruto managed to skirt out of the way and attempted to punch the flying path, but only succeeded in getting one of his arms caught. In a sudden feat of strength though, Naruto whirled, using his more stable footing as a pivot to throw the mechanical Akatsuki member into a nearby cliff face, ripping off two of its arms in the process. Before any respite could be had though, his eyes widened as his passive water sense informed him of the nearby danger, allowing him to lean back to avoid being ruthlessly stabbed by another chakra rod. His hand came up at the same moment as Tendu's, both of them widening their eyes slightly as their hands pointed at one another, only inches apart, the invisible gravitational forces already unleashed. Kaden. Enden. Jiraiya kept his fingers in front of him as he exhaled a sudden stream of burning hot flames that quickly combined with the enormous stream of oil that Gamabunta was providing. They combined in the air to produce a roaring inferno that quickly engulfed the unbelievably huge rhinoceros that had been charging them down. The pitiful creature roared in vain for a few moments as it burned, unable to quench the oil-driven flames as it writhed on the ground before finally succumbing to its injuries and bursting into smoke. The white-haired toad sage wiped his brow from having to perform 3 high-level summoning techniques as well as all these combination techniques. It was almost as if his age were beginning to catch up with him. He quickly laughed off his own concerns before steadying himself as yet another large explosion swept past him, the displaced air causing a few windows to rattle and his hair to move. This time though the blast seemed to come from much further away, outside of the village itself, which made him look around. Sure enough, in the forests just to the side of the Hokage mountain, at the base of a particularly large hill, a plume of smoke rose from what appeared to be a newly created clearing. It was too far away for him to try and tell just what was going on, but he left it to the shinobi that were closer. Right now he had a job to do. The summons that had been harassing the village were finally staying dead for whatever reason, as opposed to being replaced almost as soon as they were destroyed, and Jiraiya was taking the opportunity to deal with them quickly and efficiently. He had received word that Hiruzen was badly injured, so in essence he was the highest ranked shinobi that was able to coordinate the village's efforts. Still, he couldn't fight off the mild nagging feeling he had at the back of his mind that something was wrong. Naruto groaned lightly as he pried himself out of a particularly large tree trunk his body had managed to embed itself into. His recollection of the last few moments seemed a little muddled, but he at least knew that the use of 2 very high-level gravity manipulation techniques that closed together was just a terrible idea. He dropped to the ground, having to take a knee to clear his swimming head. Unfortunately for him, his opponent suffered no such restrictions of pain, rather ironically. Sure enough, Tendo emerged from the trees, blood covering some parts of his body and much of his Akatsuki robe torn to shreds but otherwise still in one shape. You have fought well, Naruto Uzumaki, is only to be expected from a bearer of the Rinnegan. You had the potential for a great deal of things, but ultimately you chose to stand against my vision of peace, and now you pay for it, kneeling before me. Naruto let out a cynical laugh as he struggled to his feet again, his legs still a little shaky as he did his best to heal the damage that impact had done to him. I'm not done yet. He managed to push off his knee and stand firmly on his feet, glaring back defiantly at the stoic expression of the sole remaining body of Pain. No, this ends here, now. You were right when you said these puppet bodies of mine are mere facsimiles of the true power we possess as successors to the sage. However, Tendo suddenly clasped his hands together and Naruto was able to witness a positively enormous amount of chakra swirl between them, growing and compressing, becoming more and more dense until it became almost blinding to look at with his chakra-sensitive eyes. With just this body left, those restrictions are far looser. When the spiky-haired man opened his hands again, a tiny little black ball floated between them before suddenly flying out of his hands and taking to the sky, pulsating almost excitedly. Be honored that you would force me to go this far. Naruto's eyes widened in surprise and fear as the ground around him began to crack and shake, all the while Pain stared on impassively. Chibaku Tensai. Chapter 86. Embers Part 10. Understanding is a two-way street. Eleanor Roosevelt. It was chaotic. The ground and everything else around Naruto was being ripped out of the earth, towards the pulsating black sphere that had quickly been covered by an increasingly thick layer of, well, everything. Trees, rocks, even massive chunks of the ground itself were pulled into the air and mercilessly crushed against the small singularity that only seemed to grow more powerful with each passing moment. As soon as Naruto felt his feet begun to leave the ground, his eyes widened. Chains shot out of his back to anchor him to the ground on nothing more than an instinctual self-preservation instinct. Tendo Pain just stood there, seemingly unaffected by the enormity of his own technique as the ground around him began to buckle and contort between two conflicting gravitational fields. Desperately, Naruto raised a hand, not even bothering to say the name of the technique as he silently willed himself closer to the earth. However, all he achieved was some slack on the chains, which was only disrupted a moment later when even the ground he was anchoring himself onto began to feel the draw of the miniature planetary body in the making. It is useless now, Uzumaki. This is the sage's strongest technique, the one he himself used to place the moon in the sky. There is no escape now, only capture. I'm sure you will live though. With that seemingly final remark, Naruto felt the ground beneath him finally give, a huge slab of it slowly rising into the air and taking his with it, still dangling from his chains. He released them, finding no use in securing himself to a piece of earth that was actually rising faster than him. Instead, he set his sights on the body of Pain still watching him impassively. Surely if that was destroyed, then it would disrupt the technique. Kaden. Naruto brought his hands around his mouth like a funnel, fanning and heating his chakra until he could blow out a white-hot steam of much more concentrated flame than last time. However, as an unfortunate side effect of his brash thinking, the attempted attack only succeeded in propelling himself closer to the sphere still growing in the sky. Pain himself was able to dash out of the way of the powerful, but ineffective stream of flames in a flicker of motion. Naruto attempted to right himself in the air by sending out tens of chains, grabbing onto whatever floating debris he could reach to try and steady himself. Seeing the way Pain dodged though dredged up something in the blonde's mind, from the rarely touched section belonging to Yagura's memories. However, as he prepared to use a technique known to most Junin shinobi, the body flicker, he noticed how far this technique had begun to reach in its hunger. He watched with mounting horror as rooftops on the buildings in the outskirts of Konoha began to wobble and shake before violently being plucked from their perches, the actual stonework and masonry not far behind as it too began to crack and break apart. It quickly dawned on Naruto that he would not be the only one affected by this monstrosity of a jutsu, but if Pain's claims were true, then it could grow to unbelievable sizes, possibly taking the entirety of Konoha with it. With that, Naruto's eyes hardened, his features set in a cold mask of determination as he turned his body towards the growing second moon. Running from this was not an option, he had to destroy it by whatever means he could. He stopped struggling, actually propelling himself towards the earthen mass so he could halt it before it grew too dangerous. He grunted as his feet touched down on the strange body, fighting down his nausea at the conflicting feelings he was getting of being pulled between the technique and the earth. He pulled chakra in his arm to an almost ludicrous degree, reaching a point where Tsunade would scold him for being reckless. Ah! With a great cry of effort, the blonde crashed his chakra-enhanced fist straight into the ground, causing a tremendous shockwave of displaced air to ripple outwards, actually diverting a few of the incoming slabs of rock and earth. His eyes widened when the entire spherical mass shook, large cracks breaking out over its surface, only for it to shortly stop. A moment later and the entire planetary mass just seemed to shudder as Naruto realized with irritation all he had done was help loosen the ground so it could become denser in turn. Already Naruto was having to reinforce his legs against the massive pull that threatened to crush his body. The gravity was a lot more concentrated than the Earth's pull after all. The monk's eyes widened in sudden surprise as an ominously large shadow fell across his body. Pain watched with some satisfaction as a particularly large chunk of earth crashed into the growing body of rock right on the spot his opponent had been desperately trying to destroy it. He was about ready to cancel the technique, not wanting to kill the Jinchuriki, when he noticed that something was wrong, a frown appearing over his face. Instead of the expected crash he had been waiting for, the chunk of earth just seemed to meld with the Chibaku Tensei. He quickly realized why when the rock had been converted into parted, revealing a head of spiky blonde hair. Naruto grimaced as he pulled himself out of the sand that was quickly growing more and more dense, stealing away his control over it. It was a pretty idiotic move but it had been more on reflex than anything. He certainly knew he didn't want to try and control the entire floating mass this way. The only thing worse than being stuck in a floating, heavy sphere of rock would be being stuck on a floating, heavier sphere of tightly compressed sand he would be completely unable to move his body in, even with his impressive control of it. There would be no destroying it then as the sand would only absorb impacts. He shook the sand out of his hair before reaffirming his features. Already the wave of destruction rippling out from the floating sphere was making its way through the village. It was merciless and completely indiscriminate in its destruction, tearing through houses and streets, stone and metal, plants and glass alike. The monk tore himself out of the sand, gritting his teeth as much thicker than normal chains burst from his back, flying through long, curving roots as he stretched them out further than he had ever really tried before. The thick silvery chains eventually wrapped around the entirety of the still-growing sphere, like some kind of strange ribbon on a large earthen present. However, the exertion of stretching the manifestations of his chakra that far has small rivulets of sweat dripping from his brow. Ji Gedu, Kusurg Kusari. The chains seemed to pulse once before constricting, digging in deep and scarring the dense orb even as they were covered up by more and more debris being piled on. Shakily, still maintaining his control, the blonde raised a hand, allowing another thick chain to fly forward, embedding itself deep in the ground below them. With visible effort in the bulging of his chakra-enhanced muscles, Naruto began to drag himself forward, taking the enormous sphere with him. However, a moment later the chain snapped back, wrenched from the ground. When Naruto looked down he only saw the grim face of Pain looking right back up at him. A new flash of anger and determination filled the blonde as he whispered a silent apology to his tenant, going perfectly still. A shadow clone burst into corporeal form beside him, catching a large slab of rock that had been heading towards them and using it as a makeshift shield against more debris piling on top. However, it quickly became apparent the exertion of holding back. Such weight against such a strong gravitational force was too much. The clone dropped to a new, its hair slowly drenching with sweat and the veins in its arms and neck pushing against its skin. All the while Naruto stayed perfectly still as he sought out the natural energies of the world amidst the storm of rock and earth. Naruto, stop this, it will only result in your death. I have no idea how my energies within you will react to the Senjutsu chakra. Naruto's face though remained serene, calm, resigned. It doesn't matter anymore, if I wait any longer hundreds will die because of this technique, all because of me. Even if it gives me just 10 seconds I can at least try. Kurama growled lowly, frustrated and angry at being ignored. He was unable to understand why the human was doing this to himself. They aren't worth your life, you are more important than them. Naruto let out a small internal chuckle that sounded almost sad, making sure externally his body didn't move. It's like you don't know me at all, Kurama. Again, another growl ripped from the fox's throat as it slammed a paw down within the seal. You promised that girl you would return to her. Kurama was sure the idea of abandoning Fu would at least give Naruto pause and he was becoming desperate, already feeling the tentative strands of the powerful foreign energy brush against Naruto's coils. However, to his surprise Naruto only let out a small, regretful sigh as he worked to welcome the energy, harmonizing his body with it. I love Fu, but she will understand. With that statement Kurama went quiet, unable to think of anything to say, not that it would have mattered at this point. It was already too late. Glowing, golden Rinnegan eyes snapped open and the entire sphere, now almost a kilometer across, shuddered. Slowly Naruto spread out his hand, feeling his chakra mold as easily as ever, the unrestrained energy of the world using his body as a conduit for its power. Then, suddenly and without warning, he closed it again. Kenkyona Jabun. Pain decided to wait this time as he saw the visage of his blonde opponent vanish beneath a few tens of feet of rubble, stone and various masonry. Behind him Konoha continued to get torn up and ripped apart to fuel the monstrosity hanging in the air as though it was a part of some great plays set, hanging from invisible strings attached to the sky. In truth, the self-proclaimed god had never used the technique to this extent before, and the fact the Kyuubi Jinchuriki would warrant its use without even drawing into the beast's power was staggering. Despite all his claims though, Pain could not keep this technique going on like this, and he knew it would naturally come to a conclusion before the majority of Konoha was threatened. That was why the first icy tendrils of worry had begun to infect the Rinnegan user's mind as he saw Naruto struggle against the technique with varying levels of success. Had the blonde simply found some way to outlast the growing body, or even worse, accidentally destroyed its core in his desperate flailing, it might have proven disastrous for him. The technique was trying for a Megacure's ruler, and right now even the one surviving body of his Six Paths technique was operating with less than satisfactory efficiency. He paid it no mind then when the sphere shuddered once. They were still just the blind groping of a being that had not yet accepted its fate in the face of a god. Even as he began to notice that some of the debris flying towards the sphere didn't quite make it, instead suddenly falling towards the ground as it got close, he passed it off as the technique slowly losing strength. However, as Tendo began to feel his body becoming heavier, and the ground around him that was directly beneath the miniature moon stopped rising up, he finally took notice. When he looked up, he didn't do what one might have expected him to do in a situation like this. He didn't look shocked, or fearful, or surprised, or even blink. He simply stared up as the enormous kilometer-wide sphere of dense, gravity-compacted stone and rock fell from the sky, rushing towards him with all the strength and power of a meteor. Just a brief moment before the impossible mass crushed him, the very smallest hints of an amused smile flickered across the puppet's face, then, nothing. Jiraiya found himself running much faster than he had in a long while, since he had learned that his prized student had fallen in battle with the Kyuubi, and he had rushed back to the village. In fact, everyone in Konoha had seen the enormous sphere slowly form just outside of the village before it slowly began to encroach on their home. However, where others had stood petrified in shock or fear or even simple awe, Jiraiya had immediately taken action. Not only was something of this magnitude beyond anybody else in this village besides Tsunade at this point, but as it reached its zenith, Jiraiya had felt the distinct feeling of a fellow sage tapping into the potent energies of the world. It was the reason Jiraiya was running with his hands clasped firmly together, a grim expression on his face as he focused his chakra delicately in preparation for summoning the two elder toads of Myobokuzen. They wouldn't be happy, but when they realized it was another sage Jiraiya might be about to fight, they would certainly understand, he hoped. However, that concentration was instantly shattered as the great earthen sphere actually fell from the sky, accelerating downwards. The old sage wasted absolutely no time, he rushing through hand seals like there was no tomorrow, which if he failed there might not have been, at least for Konoha. A lot of luck went into how little damage the village took from being crushed under a veritable tsunami of debris and rubble from the resulting impact of the kilometer-wide sphere impacting with the earth at staggering speed. For one, the gentle slope of the side of the Hokage mountain did a lot to divert the brunt of the destructive wave. Second, Konoha was built in a vaguely circular shape, so the rubble that did meet the edge of the wall was somewhat shunted and only a few houses and streets were crushed. However, praises would be sung of Jiraiya and the enormous toad Gameken, who had used his equally large shield to take the major brunt of the impact. When the smoke cleared and the dust settled, though, it became abundantly clear that the landscape of Konoha had been irrevocably changed. A field of rubble and broken, shattered stone lay to the southern edge of the shinobi village, and the Hokage mountain had seemed to become a little smaller than the white-haired pervert remembered. That mattered little though, as Jiraiya could still feel the presence of the other sage. He hopped of Gameken's back after a quick thanks to the thoroughly confused toad before dashing across the now barren section of what had once been forest, once again building up his chakra to summon the two elders. Once again though, he was disrupted as he saw movement amongst the earth and stone. A moment later and there was a muffled grunt of exertion as a blonde mop of spiky, ponytailed hair burst from the ground, the monk looking somewhat annoyed as he hefted a particularly large boulder off his body with the ease Jiraiya would have expected from Tsunade. For a moment the Toad Sage looked on in shock, the two elders forgotten as Naruto brushed himself off almost casually, checking to see if the bell in his hair had survived the descent. Naruto. Of course Jiraiya eventually overcame his shock, blinking in confusion at the young monk that was covered in dust. A moment later though and the dirt covering his body seemed to just float off him, becoming granular like sand with a simple motion of the boy's wrist. There would be no fixing the boy's torn robes with the same ease though. The monk looked up, smiling at the older sage as he finished pulling himself out of the boulders and rubble created in the impact. One moment please Jiraiya-san. The teen held up a finger, stumping the white-haired man as the boy looked around for a few moments before flickering in an unmistakable body flicker. Jiraiya was about to take off after him when he returned not a moment later, now holding his shakuju in hand which had surprisingly survived the impact without so much as a dent. What's going on here? What happened to your seal? Where is the invader? What was that technique just now? How are you even alive? The rapid stream of questions from the befuddled man gave Naruto an opportunity to walk closer, desperately hiding the pain he was in. Doden chakra, his Asura path and a healthy dose of nature chakra only went so far in reinforcing his body when he had a front row seat to a meteor strike. After a moment Jiraiya finally took notice of something he had ignored in his surprise, gawking even more. Is that you who is currently using senjutsu? Naruto wasn't sure why he was all that surprised that the man knew about the sage arts. All the opponents he had fought with it seemed to know anyway. Give me a moment to gain my bearings first please Jiraiya. The Toad Sage nodded reluctantly but in that brief moment when he let his guard down Naruto lashed out, tapping the man firmly on the chest with the end of the staff. In an instant Jiraiya found his ability to both mold his chakra and move his body stolen away in an instant. Somewhere back in Konoha Gamaken suddenly poofed out of existence. Good, now we can talk, at least for a short while, there are still things to do. Jiraiya frowned but quickly realized his could still speak despite whatever had been done to him. What did you just do? Naruto sighed, cracking his neck as he sat down on a nearby boulder, very much conscious that he didn't have a lot of time to speak. It's not very nice having your chakra taken away against your will is it? Jiraiya narrowed his eyes for a moment before letting out an all too reluctant sigh. Point taken kid, now can you undo this? Naruto looked up for a moment and contrary to his usual nature decided to act just a little childish for once. Pain was dealt with, or at least the puppet bodies he operated through, obviously for some important reason. It will wear off in a few hours. Jiraiya's face grew serious at the flippant answer as the older sage attempted to flex his chakra and break whatever it was that was suppressing him to no avail. This is no time for jokes Naruto. The white-haired man was surprised then when Naruto's own expression darkened, gaining years that didn't belong there and subconsciously making the older man cringe slightly, not that he physically could. I agree, but there is also a point to be proven. I knew about the leader of the Akatsuki, I knew about his Rinnegan. In fact I was on my way to Omegakure to deal with the issue myself when Konoha decided that my safety was suddenly their concern. Again Jiraiya would have flinched from the icy tone in the blonde's voice if he could. Many lives could have been prevented from dying today. With that last saddened statement Naruto got up and walked away, leaving Jiraiya alone to fruitlessly struggle against his invisible bonds and ponder the monk's words. Kurama, what's going on in there? What's the damage? He was curious to know as ever since he had entered sage mode he had felt no ill effects. When the silence within his mind went on for a little too long he tried again. Kurama. A long, withdrawn sigh was his answer, making him almost pause for a moment in confusion. Naruto I am sorry. This time Naruto did pause, in fact he nearly fell over at the sudden apology before walking on more briskly, waiting for an explanation. I didn't know, when you took in the nature energy it calmed my chakra somehow. Right now it is no more dangerous to you than your own chakra. Naruto's face darkened momentarily, understanding the apology all of a sudden. If Naruto had entered sage mode earlier he wouldn't have been at risk and he could have possibly ended the conflict much earlier, saving many lives. After a moment though a long breath escaped his lips before his continued on, his senses spread out for what he was looking for. It is fine Kurama, you didn't know. Anyway, if I had used senjutsu that early, maybe Pain would have used that technique in the middle of the village, who know how many lives could have been lost then. Naruto knew the old fox didn't actually care about the loss of human life, he had accepted that the Biju couldn't be changed so quickly. However, it at least showed that the creature respected the blonde enough to at least try to empathize, however insincere it was. Momentarily Naruto wondered just what he had done to leap up to this level in the fox's eyes, but he wasn't complaining. A few moments later and Naruto found what he was looking for in the half-crushed body of the last of Pain's puppets, his torso sticking up out of the rocks. Hesitantly, in case it was a trap, Naruto removed one of the chakra receivers from the corpse's arm before shaking the blood off with a grimace. He got a good feel for the chakra with his sage-enhanced sense before crushing the small black rod, following the path the chakra took until his eyes rested on a particularly large hill. He supposed it only made sense to be somewhere high when transmitting signals, and with a look of determination he set off. The blonde had a few images in his head of what to expect of Pain. A desiccated, red-haired man strapped into a machine that looked like it was the only thing keeping him alive was not one of them. The two Rinnegan users stared at one another, in person, for the first time, and for a while both were silent. One was sizing the other up, trying to glimpse their intentions while wondering why they weren't dead yet. The other was simply taking in their fellow Dujutsu bearer, wondering if somehow this was what they could have become. You weren't exactly what I was expecting. Naruto's voice finally broke the painfully deafening silence, snapping Pain out of his thoughtful trance, their eyes still firmly glued on one another. I could very well say the same thing. Pain's voice, his real voice, was raspy but deep, and Naruto imagined had his body not been in such a frail, fragile state it would have been incredibly imposing, like it was through the puppets he used. So what now, Naruto Uzumaki, do you kill me? Naruto's hand slowly opened and closed, balling into a fist before relaxing over and over. I don't know. In truth, Naruto wasn't sure what he had been thinking. He had no idea of what he was going to do or say when he finally met the other Rinnegan user in person. The answer seemed to surprise Pain as well, and once again the two were in silence. What is your name? Pain looked up, his eyebrows slightly raised at the odd question. My name. He had not been asked his name in such a long time. Even Conan had long since given up trying to call him anything other than Pain. Nagato. Naruto closed his eyes for a moment, and Nagato considered firing the chakra rod hidden inside his walking machine, but stayed his hand for a reason he himself wasn't entirely sure of. He didn't expect it would have done much anyway. Nagato, I guess I just wanted to meet you, to try and understand how all of this happened, how you became this way. A dry, short laugh escaped the self-proclaimed god's lips. It rattled the many long chakra receivers that were stuck into his back like some gruesome impersonation of a hedgehog. Understanding is pointless unless you share pain. That is the only way for two humans to truly understand one another. Naruto frowned, his hand still unconsciously flexing as he stood there. But why does it have to be that way? Why can't mankind understand one another through positive emotions? A shared understanding of the love as opposed to the loss, the happiness as opposed to the misery. Nagato regarded the young idealistic boy for a while, seeing so much of his friend in the boy that it was almost painful. You are naive, mankind will always know pain, it is the only common ground between us all. You cannot understand if you have never felt it, but the greed and selfishness of those who have only suffered superficially will always lead to the greater misery of others. That is why people need to understand great hardship equally. Naruto frowned again before stepping forward. Help me understand. Nagato couldn't question what Naruto meant before the blonde walked over quickly, grabbing the redhead's hand and pulling it out of the machine before he could utter so much as a protest. Show me your pain, Nagato. With that, the blonde placed his hand over Nagato's forehead while doing the same with the other Rinnegan user's hand on his own. Human path. Naruto smiled brightly as his father bounced him up and down on his knee, happily giggling to himself while his mother watched on from nearby, a light smile on her face as she saw the two play with each other. Ka-san, Ka-san. The woman walked over, bending over for her son with that same warm, comforting smile that always made Naruto feel better. Yes, my little Na-chan. Naruto just giggled and reached out to touch his mother's hair. He always loved the bright red color of it, even if the other kids in the village said it was a weird color. It made him feel like he belonged because it was the same color as his own. It was a sign of his family, that warm place that he could always return to. His mother just smiled softly, his father still bouncing him on his knee, and Naruto knew this was where he would always be happy. Nagato grinned brightly as another bowl of steaming ramen was placed in front of him, just awaiting the fate of the 6 others that were stacked messily to the side. He looked up with that same shit-eating smile as he placed his hands together, nodding comically with his chopsticks eagerly clasped in his hands. Itadakimasu. The girl behind the counter of the little ramen shop giggled into her hand as the boy wolfed away at the food like he had never had a meal in his life. Slow down, Naru-kun. Nagato looked up, cute confusion over his face as a single noodle dangled from the corner of his mouth. Ayame reached over and wiped some sauce off his chin, making the young boy look away with a blush blooming brightly over his cheeks. Thanks, Ne-chan. The girl just waved it off as she picked up the latest of Nagato's conquests, taking it into the back of the shop. For a moment Nagato just watched her go, recollecting the short months it had been since he found the little stand and they welcomed him in. He wondered if this was what having a family felt like. Naruto trembled in fear, back pressed against the small cabinet next to the shattered remains of the vase he had knocked down. In front of him he heard his mother utter the last words she would ever say, telling him to run. Lightning flashed outside and he caught sight of the stylized leaf symbol on the man's forehead protector, the man who had his kunai buried in his mother's chest. He felt the tears slide down his cheeks as the 2 shinobi walked closer, saying something that was drowned out in the maelstrom of his own thoughts. One emotion stood out above all the others, above the fear and the sadness, the shock and the nausea, anger. A blind, boiling rage ripped forth from the back of his mind as he screamed out his fury. Then he knew nothing. Nagato felt his hands shaking as he looked down at his blood-soaked fingers, covered in Ayame's blood. He looked up, the imprint of those 3 black tomo on a red background forever imprinted in his memory as the 2 shinobi approached him, one with their kunai raised. His hands stopped trembling even as his nose was filled with the tangy scent of blood, and for a moment he experienced a strange calm in his mind before it gave way to a white-hot, burning rage. A feeling of intense heat and energy welled up inside of him, like in pressure that was screaming to be released, so he just let it all out. Then he knew nothing. Naruto flinched as the door was slammed in his face, rain falling down on him and soaking him through to the bone with only his thin clothing to protect him. At least this house had actually bothered to open their door for him, the others had simply called out from behind the doors or from windows. His stomach growled pitifully and he did his best to ignore it, but he just felt so weak, so hungry. He forced his tired, aching legs to go on, to walk those small steps to the next house, hoping he would find more luck there. That hope was fleeting at best. Nagato ran down the streets, trying to keep his eyes on the dusty ground of one of Konoha's bustling streets. On either side of him he could practically feel the glares and harsh looks of the passers-by. He felt something warm on his face and brought a hand up to wipe it off, only to be confused when he found tears. He shook his head, wiping away the rest of them with his forearm as he ran on. He would show them, he would make them stop looking at him like that, like he wasn't even human. He would prove his existence to them somehow. Naruto looked on warily as Yahiko spoke to the 3 ninja. Conan stood beside him looking just as nervous. He fidgeted, looking down so that his hair covered his eyes like he had become so used to doing. When Yahiko came back, though one of the ninja had actually come with him, he was tall with long spiky white hair. Naruto could practically feel the power radiate off him and knew this man could easily get rid of them with a flick of his wrist, like the black-haired one that looked like a snake had suggested. However, when he managed to work up the courage to look up, he only saw the man giving him a cheesy smile. Naruto wasn't even sure why he smiled back, it was like such a look just couldn't have gone unanswered. It was a small, pathetic smile, but it was still a smile. Nagato trailed behind the elderly monk, shooting knots of subtle glances out of the simple windows they passed. He saw various monks going about their day, a few even looked around and saw him, making him avert his gaze. He stopped when he realized Chukaku had stopped in front of him, the elderly man looking around at him with a mirth-filled smile. Slowly the man extended his hand and after a long moment of hesitation Nagato tentatively took it, returning the smile weakly. The hand was warm, it felt nice, and Nagato felt a tiny sliver of the burden on his heart lighten. Naruto's eyes became wide, his heart practically stopping as he heard felt warm liquid drip down his hands. It was so sudden, so fast, he hadn't even known what was going on before Yahiko had crossed the distance between them, letting the kunai in Naruto's shaking hands bury itself into his body. Keep on living, together with Konan. Yahiko's last words echoed in his mind as his friend finally slumped to the side, the light leaving his eyes and a smile on his face. Nagato stood there trembling for another few moments before an old, familiar sensation welled up inside of him. His hand clenched once as his mind became clouded by a primal, burning rage. His ringed, steel-gray eyes became murderous as he raised his hand up at the oncoming wall of steel. Shinra Tensai. Nagato froze as Shizuku leaned up and wiped off the tear that had been clutching onto his cheek. Her warm blood was covering his hands and he could do nothing to stop it, all the power he had and it was just useless. Please don't cry. His breath hitched as Shizuku gave him the best smile she could manage, blood still dripping from the corner of her mouth. Then Nagato watched in agonizing clarity as the light slowly left her beautiful violet eyes. Everything else became muffled as the image was permanently burned into his memory thanks to his Rinnegan. Absently he felt the hundreds of kunai being thrown his way and just didn't find it in him to care. He didn't, until he found his apathy being replaced. The emptiness he felt began to fill with anger, rage, fury. He lifted an arm quickly towards the oncoming barrage of weapons and uttered a single phrase under his breath. Shinra Tensai.